It doesn't get any easier attending the funeral of someone you love. This was the funeral of my wife, one of many wives. I'm telling you this because she is one of my fondest memories. Where humans are concerned, love is the only law, and that's coming from a man who has literally seen everything. She was a healthy 146 when she died. Yeah, science never came up with a solution for falling off a cliff. A man next to me utters the usual refrain. She was a fine woman. My thoughts and prayers are with you. Humanity went through many changes, but in terms of death speech, we were always predictable, right up until the last human took his final breath. The year of my wife's funeral, I was technically 387 years old, which made me a baby in relative terms. Those days, they only used aquamation, dissolving bodies in water. Basic stuff, it would turn out. The universe would disappear one day, and I'll be there. But I guess you want to know how it got to that point. I was born on January 1st, 2000. I have no idea who my parents were, since the story I've been told is that I was found by 3 hikers on a hilltop wrapped in a blanket of fur that was slightly lit by the North Star. I went into foster care, but around the age of 18, I told my foster parents I wanted to travel the world. I got to the age of around 35, and I think that's about the time I stopped aging. When I hit 45, people would say to me, "Ooh, you look so good for your age." When I hit 55, things got really weird. I had to start telling everyone I was taking supplements, and in the end, I just left the country, not wanting to become a scientific research project. The good thing was that I was almost constantly on the move and seemed to be good at everything I did. My first life was easy. I had a natural aptitude for everything. And when I say natural, I mean I could do anything I wanted. Back when humanity was still here and in its early stages, I was a doctor, a professional rugby player in New Zealand, a Martian virologist, a British biologist who spent most of his time studying fleas, a very successful autonomous flying vehicle salesman, and a fairground puppeteer in New Hampshire. Oh, and I can't mention all the jobs. There were lots of them before work became almost obsolete. I had as much money as I needed, when we still used money, of course, although it was sometimes difficult keeping my identity hidden when banking the stuff, when we still had banks. Banks we would later say were from the second dark age. You're probably wondering how I managed to not have an accident and maybe get all chewed up. Well, back before we started eating only lab-made artificial meat, I fell into an industrial meat grinder. I'll take that as my best death ever. I loved that job too. Being an expert in every lifetime gets boring after a while, so I was sausage meat. Don't ask me how it happens, but after every death I would just wake up in some place in this same body. One body could die, but another would appear. I'd look in the mirror and I was the same man. I had a soul, and it seemed I was immortal. I kind of liked the days when accidents were common. It made life more fun. But once humans stopped working and using machines to do all the work, people didn't have many accidents. But like I said, one of my wives fell off a cliff. May she rest in peace. She was the only one I stayed with until the end, because I told her my secret. The rest I left after a few years. That wasn't always easy, I can tell you. Okay, so let me take you through the first chapter of my life, the short period of about 500 years. It'll have to be an abridged version, because I'm pretty sure you don't need to know about all my personal romances, achievements, and so on. This story is about you guys, not about me. And all I'll say is after 100 or so funerals, it doesn't get any easier. Love is infinite, and listen to me when I tell you, it is the greatest thing in the universe. You guys actually figured that out for a while after the Great Machine Occupation and ensuing war, when you finally did away with class oppression. Hundreds of years before the war, you guys got pretty good at creating artificial intelligence, and this meant a lot of you had no jobs to do. But the problem was, this created inequality like the world had never seen. And this started around the 2050s. Before you start thinking that we could replicate human brains and robots that were just like us, stop, because we never could. There is something in all of you that cannot be replicated. It was the great mystery for science of all ilk, and that was what is consciousness. What makes you you? It's your soul, and when you die, it doesn't mean that you get to become a ghost and start moving around household objects just to scare American families to death. It just means you're a presence. You've been left behind. Kind of an after effect, but something that now has no thoughts of its own. You become part of everything. Just as that Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza said when he wasn't grinding those lenses of his, you have a soul and we are all connected. That's why, my friends, that love is the law. Don't you ever forget it. Anyway, enough with the lecturing. So in the early third millennium, we started using some world-changing technologies. We used these to create robots that did most of the work for us. They were not at first that intelligent, so no, they did not sit down with you and chat about your ongoing agony regarding your sense of futility. They were like Alexa, but with better answers. They did all the hard work, and partly because of this, we had less to do. At first, there was this great divide, when anyone who owned these technologies grew incredibly rich. But then there was the Great Revolt, and incredibly rich people soon understood that it was no good being rich when you were dead. We soon genetically engineered most of our food, and we put an end to environmental degradation. The world flourished for a while, and we called this the Second Renaissance. We still had cattle, but things like cows became almost ornamental. We actually had a pet cow, and she was lovely. My girlfriend wanted to call her Daisy, but we decided on Ermintrude. We could even make genetically engineered milk. Humans from 2250 looked back at humans in 2020 as total savages. Those barbarians, they said, were cruel, nasty, they were imbeciles. We had colonized Mars by this time, but as exciting as that might sound to you, people didn't much like living in spaces from which they could not move out of unless they wore a pressurized spacesuit. Life on Mars was a bit of a chore. Even Elon Musk would have admitted it was a bit dull up there if he'd lived to see it. At first, Mars was more like a gimmicky thing. I think it was about in 2880 or something that we finally terraformed the planet. That means creating an inhabitable atmosphere there. Still, I always preferred Earth. I remember a guy once joking with me when we were on Mars. This was after we'd terraformed the place, and I said to him, "It's a bit of an anticlimax," and he laughed and replied, "Yeah, the grass is always greener." You'd only get that if you'd been on Mars, because while we did learn how to grow grass on the red planet, it was never like the luscious green grass of Earth. His joke was what you'd call a double entendre. Okay, so after the Great Divide came the Great Awakening, and that's when humans started sharing everything. We had no need to work, really, and the work we did was more in line with helping people and creating things. There was hardly any crime, and we viewed the justice system of your time like you now view medieval torture. The problem was those machines we'd created had become super intelligent, and that didn't mean that they could fall in love and tell us how great they thought the movie Blade Runner was, but it meant that they could solve problems that we couldn't. And by the way, we didn't actually watch movies in those days. We were movies. Virtual reality was as real as life, and you could choose your story. Anyway, as I said, this was great at the start. Machines didn't just do all the heavy lifting, but they devised ways to make everything sustainable. The thing was, some idiot asked a machine how to end depression, loneliness, anxiety, sorrow, and all the human emotions we didn't much like. The emotions that made us, us. The machine's answer to that was a contradiction because for those emotions not to exist, we couldn't exist. The simple solution to the problem was to terminate us. This wasn't out of animosity. Like I said, robots didn't have feelings. Our brains are way too complex. They wanted to terminate us because we had asked the machines to solve a problem. It wasn't personal. Some of those machines were weapons. While wars were a thing of the past, we used powerful destructive devices for things like drilling and creating cities in places that were once uninhabited. And we also stockpiled weapons in case of an extraterrestrial invasion. You've also got to understand that simple robots were household appliances. I had a robot dog that doubled as a lawnmower and a leaf blower. It's a long story, and I have a long way to go, but I'll tell you that before we won the war, lots of human lives were lost. The superintelligence was interconnected, so before you could say, oops, the machines turned on us. A friend of mine was killed by his own fridge. In the end, we created another superintelligence whose sole purpose was to defend humanity. Then we had something called the Machine Wars, while we hid out in the underworld, something that we'd created about a century earlier. The underworld was devised in case of natural catastrophes, such as asteroid hits or supervolcanoes going off. As you'll find out, we didn't do a very good job. So the good machines won, and we never made the mistake again of asking silly questions. Human emotions weren't something you can fix. We are what we are, even though a few wacky transhumanist neuroscientists did try playing around with our brains a bit. All machines were made from then on with a default mode that insisted that they must self-destruct if they asked to answer any question that could endanger a human life. And let me tell you, it took about another 100 years to get that right. As an example, a guy I knew asked his robot if getting married was a good idea, and the robot just blew up right in front of him. After analyzing the guy's and his girlfriend's trove of personal data and taking into the possibility of divorce, this was a dangerous question. I should have told you that sometime in the 4th century of the 3rd millennia, we had started living a lot longer and living healthier lives. This was mostly down to nanotechnology called cell manipulation. The thing was, we never got past around the age of 160. We just couldn't figure that out. But after time, we realized it was the mind-soul thing again. The mind can have enough. It turned out that around the age of 160, we just gave up. And maybe that's the way it was meant to be. And yes, there is a mind-soul duality, a spirit if you like. I'm living proof. To be honest with you, living forever isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's a beauty in death because it makes you appreciate life. I had a bout of chronic depression that lasted around 300 years because of that. I lost all purpose for a while. I begged for death. I prayed for death. Death was love to me. Without death, I lost the will to live. Anyway, I won't bore you with my psychological problems. We're gonna move on now to something big. Around 3500, the Earth's magnetic poles reversed, or should I say they'd been reversing, but something just happened fast. The fallout from that was more cosmic rays hitting us, and that meant more radiation. We had to hide underground for a while, and some people took off to Mars. Eventually, we developed a way to deflect the cosmic rays, but we lost a lot of humans to radiation-related sickness. The underground couldn't sustain us for long. A catastrophic event for you guys happened around 5,000 years later, and that was a supervolcanic eruption. This was so huge that the volcanic ash blocked out the sun and covered a large part of the planet. This killed many people and animals and destroyed much of what we'd built. Water supplies were contaminated and much of our electronic infrastructure that we relied on was destroyed. It made a huge mess of the natural environment too. This event cooled the planet and the atmosphere was filled with toxic gases. Suffice to say, it was a bit of a torrid time for you guys, but much worse was to come. It was called the greatest catastrophe since the dawn of civilization. But of course you didn't say it like that because the language you spoke didn't sound much like the one I'm talking to you in. Language evolved. Do you understand this? Ik bidde themale salis te sprekene? I'm guessing you don't because it's Old English. It meant please speak more slowly. Anyway, after the eruption, the population almost halved. Since many people grew sick or died from lack of food and water, or couldn't live in colder climates, this created a mass migration. With so much infrastructure down and so much panic, the era of the Great Peace was over. Many of you got all savagey again. Population decline made sure that getting started again wasn't easy, but I won't bore you with the building details because soon you're about to all become extinct. You'd survived world wars, you'd survived machine wars, you just about got over a supervolcanic eruption, but in the year 13,462 you had a period of global warming. The Wilkes Basin ice melted and the consequence of that was that sea levels rose 3 or 4 meters. The sun getting hotter was no fault of yours. The fiery thing just turned up the heat. Cities near the coastline disappeared and there was more migration. The eruption took much of the human population with it and the floods took a lot of what was left. The population was reduced again and instead of living in large communities connected globally, you started separating yourself from others and surviving in small communities. It was a bit like the old hunter-gatherer days, although strands of civilization existed. The Earth had taken such a beating over these years that the magnificent technological infrastructure that you had built almost completely disappeared. Your peaceful ways were abandoned, and like brutes from the past, gangs of men would raid communities. The population problem was real, and even women were stolen so they could procreate for various communities. You lived like this for thousands of years, slowly rebuilding what you had built before. Communities again collaborated, but much of what had been destroyed was not salvageable. You simply could not emerge as a technological species because the Earth's population had been reduced so much and you lost so much infrastructure. You did at least have books and artifacts from the past, but these were not understandable by the majority of people. Those on Mars fared better at first, but due to the heating up of the sun, that planet became almost uninhabitable. Because the terraformed environment there was so much less diverse, the Martian colony became extinct first. The final blow-up, the coup de grace, came with an impact from a large asteroid in the year 22,569. The impact created giant tsunamis and the Earth burned. It threw so much moisture and dust in the air that the sunlight was blocked. Some of you died quickly and others died slowly. I wept as I saw my 2 friends starve to death, both of them wondering why I wasn't worried at all. I wanted to die, but I had a long way to go. I wandered around that barren planet alone for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. You could say this was quite a boring era in my long life. I kept dying and reappearing. I was surely cursed to see this whole thing through to the end. Life forms still existed, but most were small animals. Snails became my best friends. I would hold them in my hand and talk to them. The first was named Brian, then came Brian 2, and so on. I married Brian 3 out of sheer boredom. I must move on because you need to know how it all ends. Hundreds of thousands of years was nothing in the great scheme of things. For millions of years I waited for something to happen, for evolution to kickstart and you guys to slowly come back, for something to crawl out of the swamp, for anything to happen. After a billion years, things got so hot that the ocean started to evaporate. After almost 3 billion years, all life forms were extinct except for me. My body no longer existed in its physical form because of the severe heat, but my mind carried on. I really was a ghost. Billions more years passed and the sun started burning hydrogen in a shell around its core, becoming a big red giant. Oceans of lava floated on the surface before the Earth itself was engulfed by the sun. I became mere consciousness in the universe, like a god able to witness the unraveling of the enterprise that started with a big bang. After 120 trillion years, and man, I was getting bored by then, there were only about 100 stars left in the Milky Way. The missing ones had literally run out of energy. I was still there, in space, just thinking, come on, just let this damn place end. I longed for the days I could fall into a meat grinder or tell jokes on Mars. Life was beautiful and I missed it dearly. Finally, after hundreds of quadrillions of years, the whole place was empty, like a football stadium during one of your many pandemics. The universe was a vacuum and we had entered a dark era. But what was nothing? What exactly was nothing? Subatomic particles were still there. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew that those particles were busy trying to break down a barrier. I just felt it. They joined forces and strained together, propagating. I was witnessing a birth. Uh-oh, I thought, here we go again. And I realized I was observing another Big Bang. The whole thing was starting again. I was seeing the eternal recurrence, a cycle both violent and beautiful. The universe started kicking and screaming like the thousands of newborn babies I'd fathered when humans existed. And that's what I'm watching right now. I've got a long time to wait until I see the next generation of you guys, but I'm at peace. In this cosmic arena, there is more than just matter. There is me, an eternal soul, a timeless monument to the spirit, an enduring love and light that I can't explain and don't want to explain. So I'll see you guys in the next life a few billion years from now. Don't forget to be nice to each other next time. Life is precious. That's what you'll learn when you live forever. Random erections, a plague of acne, and discoloration of, well, down there. Some facts of male puberty are absolutely weird. One of the strangest and messiest parts about male puberty occurs while the male is fast asleep. It's during this time that wet dreams can happen, and the reason for these unwanted nocturnal ejaculations is pretty surprising. In fact, wet dreams have more to do with what's being produced in the body than what the male is actually dreaming about. If you didn't know it already, it's completely normal for males to ejaculate in their sleep. There doesn't need to be any kind of physical stimulation, and wet dreams are not necessarily caused by dreams about sex. This isn't completely clear why males going through puberty have wet dreams, but it's theorized that they occur due to the balancing of hormones and the development of different parts of the brain and genitalia. The crazy thing is that even after puberty, males can still experience wet dreams. It's much less common, but it can still occur. Some researchers suggest that having frequent orgasms during the waking hours will reduce the amount of wet dreams. This is a fancy way of saying more masturbation reduces the number of wet dreams someone might have. Other research suggests that wet dreams are just a coping mechanism to help males deal with this stressful time in their lives. This is because during wet dreams, and any time a male orgasms, dopamine and other pleasure chemicals are released into the brain. Sticking with the genitalia for a moment, males who are not circumcised may find a unique ability develops during this time. Uncircumcised males have a flap of skin that covers the head of the penis called a foreskin. As a young male, the foreskin does not retract on its own, but after puberty all that changes. During puberty, the foreskin becomes wider and the penis becomes larger. This is mostly due to make procreation easier, but as a result, the foreskin is now retractable. One reason this new ability develops may be to ensure that when the male ejaculates, there is nothing impeding the sperm from entering the female. And this leads us to one of the most awkward things that can happen to males during puberty: the curse of the unexpected erection. For young men, it seems that there is no rhyme or reason for when arousal occurs. To be fair, it can be obvious why a male going through puberty gets an erection, like when they're around someone they find attractive, but other times it's a mystery. In fact, getting an erection during puberty does not normally mean the male is thinking about sex at all. Erections can occur rather unexpectedly because of a sudden surge of testosterone in the body. That is why a male going through puberty may be in the middle of a lecture on the Pythagorean theorem and just end up with an erection. It's not that the male finds the Pythagorean theorem sexy, it's just that the hormones in their body are all out of whack due to the changes they're going through. Before a male even begins to go through his growth spurt in height, he goes through a growth spurt in his testes. One of the first things that happens in males during a puberty is their testicle size increases. This growth occurs because the testes are where testosterone is produced, and males need a lot of this hormone to undergo the rest of the changes associated with puberty. With the growth of the testes, more testosterone can be produced, and the male can start his awkward journey into becoming a man. Soon after the testes start to grow, the penis will follow. The time between these two sex organs growing can vary, but at some point, both the testicles and the penis will become larger. And the genitalia are not the only part of the body that grows. Surprisingly, many males find that their breasts also increase in size. During puberty, some males experience growth in their chest. This swelling eventually slows down and the chest returns to normal size as time goes on. The enlargement of the breasts occurs in about 2/3 of males going through puberty, so it's more common than not. It's unclear why the male's chest needs to increase in size, but a side effect of the swelling is more sensitivity in the region. Many males find that an increased sensitivity occurs in other parts of the body during puberty as well, including the brain. Males go through mood swings during puberty due to the flood of hormones surging through their bodies. There are measurable changes that occur in the brain during the time of life in both males and females. Obviously, there are many differences between what the two sexes go through, but there are similarities as well. Both male and female brain composition changes during puberty, yet they tend to change in different ways. In one study, researchers measured the changes in the brains of 300 young adults going through puberty. The study consisted of 150 males and 150 females. The researchers focused on the regions of the brain that are associated with mood fluctuations and emotional control that may be responsible for certain illnesses such as depression. What they found was very interesting. The researchers discovered that the regions of the brain connected to the mental and emotional illnesses increased in connectivity by about 6.5% in males. The same regions in the females' brains decreased by around 7.2%. This data suggests that there are some key differences in the way female and male brains develop during puberty, but it also might be an indication that females are more resilient to mood disorders than males while going through this period of life. However, much more research needs to be done before a final conclusion can be made. An obvious change that males go through during puberty is the lowering of their voices. But what is crazy about this process has more to do with what's happening to the body than the changing of the voice itself. As a male goes through puberty, testosterone is dumped into their bloodstream and carried around the body by the cardiovascular system. The testosterone signals the voice box to go through changes to allow the voice to become lower and deeper. This happens due to the cartilage in the voice box growing in size and thickness. With larger vocal cords and more space for them to vibrate in, the pitch of the voice becomes lower. During puberty, the larynx itself starts to move down and the Adam's apple begins to protrude from the neck. At the same time, the bones of the face begin to grow larger as well. All of this new space and the increased size of the voice box allow the male voice to resonate at a lower frequency. But there's a weird side effect that occurs because of this process. It's the growth and shifting of structures in the area of the body that causes the embarrassing voice cracking that some males go through during puberty. Since the voice box, vocal cords, and skeletal structure itself is changing, the brain needs to adjust to produce the proper sounds. Unfortunately, since this is all new to the male, mistakes happen. Sometimes too much air is pushed through the larynx, causing the voice to crack. This is no fault of the male, it's just a strange side effect of them going through puberty. And just as a side note, human males are not the only animal that goes through a voice shift during puberty. Male apes and other animals also develop lower sound ranges as well. It's not entirely clear why males need to develop a lower register, but some evolutionary biologists believe that it has to do with attracting a mate after puberty. A male cannot successfully reproduce until puberty begins because this is when the sperm production starts. Therefore, in both humans and other animals, the change in voice may be a signal to females that the male is now sexually maturing and ready for procreation. Another weird fact that doesn't have so much to do with what's happening during puberty, but when puberty occurs in males. Everyone's different. This means that every male will have a slightly varied experience during this time in life. Some males will start puberty as young as 8 years old, while others won't go through it until sometime after 14. Most males begin the process somewhere in the middle of this range, but the exact age at which puberty starts can differ widely. The weird thing is that puberty is beginning to occur in males at a younger and younger age. Researchers found that as the 20th century progressed, the average age a boy went through puberty started to shift. Interestingly, this isn't just happening in males, but in females as well. Some researchers have claimed that this may be a result of exposure to certain synthetic chemicals that interfere with the way the body regulates hormones. If the chemicals are causing testosterone and estrogen to be produced and released at an earlier age, this could be one explanation for why males and females are going through puberty younger than before. Other researchers attribute this shift to biological factors. It has been proposed that the higher levels of stress associated with living in developing cities or a fast-paced society may cause the endocrine system, which produces hormones, to get out of whack. It also has been suggested that childhood obesity may throw off the hormone regulation in a young person's body, which may result in puberty occurring at a younger age as well. A final theory about why this strange shift is happening has to do with living conditions. The consumption of less nutritious foods may result in the body undergoing puberty at an earlier age. This may be occurring in communities that don't have access to healthy foods or the resources they need. This is no fault of the communities themselves, but as a result of society that places more importance on some populations than others. In areas that are considered food deserts, families may have to travel hours to purchase fresh fruit and vegetables, while less nutritious and more artificial foods may be all that's available close to home. Other than when it happens, there are further differences that occur between males during puberty. All male genitalia is slightly different. This goes for size, shape, curve, and even the rate at which they develop. But one really weird thing that happens to a male during puberty is that the color of his genitalia might change slightly. That's right, during puberty, the penis and scrotum not only change in size but in coloration as well. Normally when this happens, the genitals become slightly darker. It's not clear why this is, but most likely has to do with slight changes in the pigmentation produced by the cells during puberty. This doesn't seem to be any benefit or harm to the changing color of the penis and scrotum, but it's definitely weird. Finally, we are reaching one of the uglier parts of puberty: acne. Some males are plagued by large amounts of pimples during this stage of life. But why is this? The main reason males and females develop acne during puberty years is because the body produces massive amounts of a sex hormone called androgens. The side effect of this hormone is that the body produces more oils. These oils in turn clog the pores of the skin, while simultaneously providing a source of food for bacteria causing acne. So, the weirdest part about this whole thing is the acne is really a result of the body feeding bacteria its own dead skin cells and oils. Gross, right? Congratulations, soldier! You've just been picked to be part of a 4-man crew on an American Abrams main battle tank. That's right, you'll officially be on board one of the most powerful machines on Earth. A tank so tough that none have ever, in its entire lifetime, been destroyed by enemy fire. You may be a total badass on the battlefield, but buckle up, Buttercup, because you're about to find out why life inside a tank sucks. Like tight spaces? We sure hope you do, because the first thing you're going to notice about life inside a tank is that there's not much room to move around. The total area for crew inside a tank is only a few square feet, and that's because as you begin your new life as a tanker, you very quickly realize that the machine comes well before the humans. After all, a modern battle tank can easily level an entire neighborhood block, while you probably struggle to fight your way out of a wet paper bag. So hopefully you're not claustrophobic, because not only is the interior of a tank an extremely tight squeeze, but it gets even worse when the tank is fully buttoned down. And that's only going to be most of the time, until scientists figure out how to make humans obsolete. A tank is only as functional as its soft, squishy human crew. So anytime you're cruising around in your big, bad battlemobile, you can be sure that you're going to be locked down and buttoned up tighter than Fort Knox. Nearly every modern battle tank can operate inside a nuclear, chemical, or biological environment, meaning that when these things seal up, we mean it. Hopefully you like that air you've been breathing, because you're going to be breathing it over and over again for hours, potentially even up to 2 days straight. Scrubbers in the air filtration system will keep you from suffocating on your own carbon dioxide, but, well, they don't work quite as well on other things, like smells. So go ahead and take a quick whiff of your armpit right now, then go ahead and close your eyes and imagine how bad you might stink after spending an entire day buttoned up in an airtight tank. Sure, modern tanks have air conditioning, but when it comes to a very long list of priority equipment and systems to keep well maintained and repaired, the AC comes in dead last. If you happen to have the luck of serving in a warm, tropical, or scorching hot desert environment, then you'll very soon understand what it feels like for cookies every time you stick them in an oven. Huffing down your own funk is bad enough, but with up to a 4-man crew, you're going to have to get used to the particular flavors of your crewmates. For a good approximation of what that's like, next time you're around a sweaty friend, go ahead and stick your face in their armpit and then take several deep huffs of air. Hold it in. Really savor the sweat stank coursing down your esophagus and saturating your lungs with their salty stink. Let the vapors linger as they work their way back up your respiratory system and come up the back of your throat and into your mouth. Yeah, that's what living in a tank is like with 3 other guys. But as you check out the digs in your new battle ride, you might notice that there seem to be several critical amenities missing. You might pay upwards of $3,000 a month for the same square footage of an apartment in New York or San Francisco, but at least those places will come with a bathroom. Inside a modern tank, the only bathroom that exists is, well, the one you invent for yourself. Gotta pee? Old Gatorade bottle will do in a pinch. Just don't confuse it with, your actual Gatorade. Gotta go number 2 though? Well, there's a reason your crew commander warned you to save the plastic bag your MRE came in. That's right, even after 100 years of tank technological improvements and innovations, the best technique for taking a deuce in a modern tank is the age-old tradition of pooping in a bag. A modern tank may be the 70-ton embodiment of God's vengeful wrath on a sinful world, but while you're stuck in it, you're still pooping in your sandwich baggie. You can forget about hopping out so you can pinch a loaf off real quick from the side of the tank. Tanks operate on the most dangerous battlefields on Earth, and that means that the life expectancy of a tank crewman outside of his actual tank is vanishingly short. While you're living in a tank, you're going to be squatting your grumps in the tank, not outside of it. For our more astute viewers, this has likely already led to the question on many of your minds. What happens after you're done laying wolf bait? Like, what happens to it? Well, modern tanks are thankfully equipped with a trash incineration device that instantly disintegrates whatever trash the crew generates. Just kidding. That's right. Over 100 years of tank design, and still, the best solution to what happens after someone takes the Browns to the Super Bowl is to simply stow it away. That's tank speak for you're hanging onto your poop until it's safe to actually exit the vehicle. Hopefully your poop receptacle is airtight, but since you'll be using plastic sandwich baggies or plastic MRE bags, it most definitely will not be. At least try to tie a knot onto it and not repeat the unfortunate disaster aboard Apollo 10 when one of the astronauts' Hershey's Kisses started floating around the cabin. With all the shaking and banging a tank does as it moves around the countryside though, odds are eventually you're gonna have a loose turd rolling around. Marinating in the smells of your crew's poop, urine, and sweat, though, is only some of the perks of getting to drive around in the most powerful machines on Earth, because the other perk is occasional and extremely excruciatingly painful injuries. As we've mentioned, the actual human crew is more of an afterthought for many tank designs, and in tanks like the German Leopard 2, it's all too easy for the crew to get seriously injured, if not killed, by their own machines. One German tanker was caught in the machinery of the turret and had his femur snapped cleanly in two. Though broken arms, fingers, and even legs are not uncommon injuries for tankers. We seriously cannot overstate just how much you don't want to be in the way of a 70-ton murder machine. At least though, you'll get to make big bangs driving your tank around, and every time that big main cannon fires off, you can expect the cabin to fill up with cordite from the fired round. You can add that one to your laundry list of savory aromas you'll get to enjoy in your life inside a tank. Listen, there's one obvious perk to life inside a tank though, and that's mainly the fact that if you happen to be riding inside an American Abrams or a British Challenger, there's really not much on this modern battlefield that's going to be anything more than a pesky annoyance. Small arms fire? Kick your feet up as you enjoy the tin roof-like sound of high-caliber rounds plinking off your thick armor plating. RPGs? Those are cute, but I bet they would tickle a little bit if one hit you. They certainly tickled an American Abrams that took over 52 RPGs in one day and only suffered a thrown track. IEDs? Well, unless the IED is the size of, well, a tank, then it's not going to do much, but maybe scuff the paint. You may be feeling invulnerable, but you're also going to be a pretty priority target on any battlefield, and while anything we've discussed isn't going to do much but annoy you, there's plenty of weapons out there that can seriously crap up your day. You can be sure that if you're facing a modern or even close to modern foe, then you're going to have everything from bona fide anti-tank missiles to other tanks trying to knock you out of the fight. And while your thick armor may protect you from most things sent your way, even a hit that doesn't penetrate the armor can be deadly to the crew inside. That's thanks to spalling, or when a hit is absorbed by the tank's armor, but the energy actually causes the inside of the armor to fracture and fire off shards of razor-sharp metal inside the crew compartment. You really don't want to get in the way of 3-inch shards of scrap metal traveling a few dozen feet per second any more than you want to get your arms or legs in the way of the moving machinery inside the tank. Then there's the fact that any round that actually manages to penetrate the interior of a tank, well, it's not going to be particularly survivable for the crew. A fighter pilot can still eject if his plane is hit by a missile or gunfire, and even soldiers in a Humvee can be completely unharmed or just dazed if they roll over an IED. But if an anti-tank round hits your tank and penetrates, well, that kind of stuff is just simply not survivable. Humans are just too squishy. A high-explosive round, for instance, may not be particularly effective against modern tanks thanks to modern armor. But if you're caught with your head out of the turret when it goes off, it's gonna basically ruin your day by taking your head clean off. A high-explosive squash head round, on the other hand, is going to very much ruin your day if you're sitting inside your tank. These rounds create a large surface explosion on the outside of the tank, which causes the metal armor on the inside to shatter and spall, showering the crew with high-speed shrapnel. The use of spaced armor has made these rounds less effective, but still a danger. If you come under fire from an armor-piercing discarding sabot round, however, you better hope your armor's up to manufacturer's specs, because if it's not, it's gonna be your last day on Earth. These rounds use no explosives and instead fire a very thin needle-like projectile which penetrates through layers of tank armor. By the time the penetrator makes it to the interior of the tank, it's been fractured so badly that it turns into a deadly high-speed shower of razor-sharp shrapnel. If you're on the business end of a depleted uranium round such as those used by American tanks, then we hope you've got a solid last will and testament, because no known tank on Earth has survived a hit from one of those bad boys. Lastly, you've got high-explosive anti-tank rounds to concern yourself with, which like to mix things up by providing a fun party mix of high-speed kinetic penetrator death along with high explosives. If the kinetic projectile that punches through your armor doesn't kill you, then the searing hot explosion that follows it certainly will. And if you happen to be running around with your own ammunition exposed, then you could be sure that the sudden rise in temperature to several hundred degrees will cause your ammo to cook off, further adding to the explosive death fun. At least it'll be quick. With the threat of instant death, absolutely zero legroom, and the joy of marinating in the poop smells of a four-man crew, you might be wondering who exactly would want to even serve as a tanker anyway. Well, sure, they're uncomfortable, dangerous, and a priority target on any battlefield, but they're also pretty much the most badass machines mankind has ever made, and that in itself is a compelling argument for putting up with pooping inside of a bag for days on end. A modern tank is, after all, the literal embodiment of the wrath of a vengeful god on a sinful world. And short of another even better tank, or perhaps serious air support, there's not much that's gonna stop your rampage across a battlefield. And definitely not things as flimsy as buildings or walls. But a thrown track definitely will, and despite how tough modern tank armor is, the truth is tank treads might as well be made of eggshells for how often they get damaged or thrown. Even just taking a turn too sharp is enough for a tank to throw a track, and in that case you can look forward to the fun of having to lift hundreds of pounds of metal tracks with just you and your crewmates as you desperately try to fix your busted track so your giant murder machine can actually move. But hey, at least then you could poop outside of the tank for a change. Somewhere down the line, a dog starts barking ferociously. You don't need any more warning than that, as you and the four men you're playing chess with immediately rip at the canvas bag at your sides holding your gas masks. In the fury to tear your gas mask over your head and secure it in place, you knock over the worn and beaten chessboard, sending the pieces to the muddy floor. In a few minutes, the dog's barking is muffled. Its owner must have finally fitted a mask to it after putting his own on in a hurry. That dog's lucky. A few months ago, the few dogs on the front lines would be killed by incoming gas attacks. Thanks to their incredibly sensitive noses, these war dogs are capable of sniffing out gas attacks a minute or two before the fog-like haze settles over the front lines. Typically, the Germans blast the front with artillery shells modified to release dangerous gases rather than explode on contact. On days like today, though, when the wind is blowing from east to west and is strong enough, they can release the gas from directly outside their own trenches and have it blow across no man's land. The type of gas that might be delivered varied. Sometimes it's largely harmless tear gas, an irritant that served to suppress the enemy's ability to fight back effectively. This is typically followed by a massive assault across no man's land, though, and the effectiveness of gas masks in filtering the gas, as well as its non-lethal properties, made it less and less appealing as the Great War ground on. Germany would later claim that it begun using chemical weapons in a bid to secure quick victory, and therefore grant the world the mercy of a short war with few casualties. Man's best intentions quickly went awry. Tear gas quickly made way for three deadlier gases: mustard gas, phosgene, and chlorine gas. Chlorine gas could be easily spotted if lookouts were actually paying attention, as it moves across the battlefield like a sickly yellowish-greenish cloud. During day attacks, it gives plenty of warning and allows men to quickly don their protective gas masks. For that reason, the Germans and the Allies quickly take to using gas at night, where it can't be as easily spotted. Phosgene gas is chlorine gas's deadlier older brother. It lacks the distinctive colorization of chlorine gas, making it harder to spot, and even worse, symptoms would only set in a day or two after being poisoned. all the warning you would get was the sudden smell of wet, musty hay, and then a day or two later you'd be drowning in your own fluids. Ironically enough though, the gas you must fear the most is mustard gas. It's the most widely used chemical agent of the war. While chlorine and phosgene gas are deadly and could cause havoc on the body internally, there is a peace about knowing that if you were exposed to them, you'd likely soon die. Mustard gas, though, doesn't come with such a guarantee and is perfectly survivable. Yet breathing it in would scar your lungs for life, leaving you permanently short of breath. The giant blisters it produces on exposed skin are not only plentiful and extremely painful, but can also disfigure a man. And in the poor hygiene conditions of Europe's trench war, these blisters could burst and become infected, leading to a protracted, terribly slow death to infection or amputations. Better to die relatively quickly than linger on in agony. But you don't know what kind of gas the Germans are launching today. You do your best to protect as much of your skin as you can anyway. You scramble, rifle in hand, to a pre-prepared fighting position along the massive trench that has been your home for months. Each man has their own slit in the trench, consisting of a slightly elevated position from where they could comfortably stand and fire at incoming soldiers. As you do your best to sight down the barrel of your rifle, you scan the banks of gas clouds for human figures. Gas attacks of this sort are typically preludes to a massive attack. It's summer and the gas mask is stifling hot. Your eye holes fog up constantly and you have to try to breathe shallow to limit the fogging so you can actually see out of your mask. The gas washing over you terrifies you, and you're afraid to breathe at all now. The smallest compromise in your mask will have you sucking in deadly air. You hope that your charcoal filter will continue to filter properly. The constant humidity of the muggy trenches can seriously compromise the effectiveness of the filters. You yearn to rip the hot, muggy, uncomfortable mask off your face, but you know that to do so would be to invite certain death. Instead, you'll sit and bear it for hours on end, at least until the all clear is called. That's, of course, if the Germans don't attack. And that's when you hear it, the telltale sounds of hundreds of boots pounding the ground in front of you. There's no battle cry, no shouts from officers rallying their men forward. The gas masks of both sides are wearing make such feats impossible. There's only the sudden roaring of hundreds of rifles on both sides, mostly yours, like a freak thunderstorm sprung to life from out of the clear blue sky. Typically, attacks are preempted by massive artillery barrages that can last for a day or longer, and more than once you've had to hunker down for days on end as metal death rained down all around you. This time, though, the Germans have aimed for a surprise attack. Closely following the deadly banks of fogs, they silently released into the strong wind to cover their attack. You fire your rifle at the incoming horde of enemy soldiers. The Germans are too busy crossing no man's land to bother firing back. Everyone knows that the only hope for victory is to cross no man's land and dive into the enemy's trench. And once there, victory becomes a brutal hand-to-hand battle for survival. Prisoners are rarely taken, retreat is impossible. Tally too long in no man's land or try to retreat across it, and the machine guns will find you. A fact that the Germans are currently discovering. You thank your lucky stars that the machine gunners along your section of trench were quick to don their gas masks and are unaffected by the deadly vapors. Of all the weapons in World War I, the machine gun is the most responsible for the deadly stalemate that runs the length of the European continent, spitting out hundreds of rounds a minute. The only way to silence it is to charge headlong into its withering fire, and yet just as effective as it is on the defense, it's all but useless on the offense, the guns being far too bulky and difficult to carry across no man's land. Thus, the Great War has devolved into suicidal rush after suicidal rush, the machine gun's body count rising by the day. Now, withering machine gun fire from several positions strafes across the German advance. Men fall under its fire by the dozens, and yet incredibly the charge continues. The constant barrage of rifle fire is shockingly inaccurate. No surprise given the difficulty and accuracy firing a rifle while wearing a bulky gas mask. And in the rush across no man's land, it's machine guns that claim most victims. It's absolute lunacy, you think to yourself, to continue charging forward into the teeth of the big guns, even as you see dozens of your fellow soldiers fall before them. Then again, what choice does a charging soldier have? Retreating across no man's land will just leave them as vulnerable as charging across it. Once you're up and over the top, there's only one way to live, and it's forward. The first Germans are coming over the trenches, numbers too great even for the machine guns to overcome. Neither side needs much accuracy now in such close quarters, and the hot, fetid, and poisoned air in the trenches is now filled with acrid gunpowder as well as the deadly gas. The mixture creates a grayish fog that permeates the scene, adding a surrealness to the brutal and often hand-to-hand combat that breaks out across the front. Men stab with bayonets or knives, their rifles largely forgotten and too cumbersome for the close-in fighting. You can't tell time in the thick of the melee, but your lungs are bursting with the exertion of frantic breathing through your gas mask. Fighting in such conditions, both sides can barely manage more than a few minutes of intense combat before falling nearly completely exhausted. Entire sections of trench will unofficially fall under enemy control briefly, both sides simply too tired to keep fighting and desperate for a brief rest. The machine guns took too great a toll on the incoming assault though, and the Germans' numbers are low. You spend the afternoon doing the grim work of killing in close quarters, and the narrow, tight confines of the stretches is all too often the work of a butcher killing men too exhausted to defend themselves anymore. Some will be taken prisoner after surrendering. Most simply won't. You push away the consequences of your actions for now. Those are for a living man to deal with, and right now, there's no guarantee on your life. The battle over, the grim work of removing corpses must be attended to and quickly. The trenches must be prepared for a fresh attack coming at any minute. For now, German and Allied corpses alike are simply stashed into the small cutaways along the trenches as defensive fortifications are fixed and manned, you and the rest of the exhausted survivors preparing for a possible second wave. As the hours pass and night comes through, it becomes clear that there's no stomach in the Germans for another attack. You're grateful. You've also no stomach for more bloodshed today. At last, the all-clear signal is given for the gas, and after half a day struggling to breathe through a mask caked with sweat and blood, you rip the thing off. You thought you'd be careful before taking that first breath, the fear of lingering gas still fresh in your mind, but you're so exhausted that you greedily gulp down the fresh air, and despite the stench of gunpowder, the sickly sweet smell of the dead, and the slightly nauseating tinge of gas, that breath of air is sweeter than any you've ever tasted in your life. The Germans might attack again at night, so you can never truly afford to let your guard down. But whether they do or not, there are basic housekeeping duties to be done that are necessary in the trenches. Disease is already rampant in the muddy, unsanitary conditions of the trenches, and there's little need to aid it along, so you and a detail of soldiers work to move the dead through the network of trenches, connecting yours to those at the rear. Somewhere back there, a graves detail service will separate the German soldiers from the Allied soldiers and give as best a burial as possible. By the time you're done, you're too exhausted to even eat. But your work isn't done yet. Your life depends on two key pieces of equipment, your mask and your rifle. And thus, before you can even think of getting a few hours of much-needed sleep, you set to the task of maintaining both. Your gas mask is relatively easy to maintain, and you check it thoroughly for tears. You dry off the charcoal filter and do your best to keep it free of mud and excess moisture. Your rifle, though, is a different affair and requires a complex breakdown of its components along with a thorough cleaning. Until you arrived at the front, you had no idea just how much of war is spent simply cleaning one's weapon. They certainly left that detail out of the heroic war stories you grew up listening to. It's also important to tend to your feet, though not an easy feat. As the war has dragged on, one of the greatest sources of casualties is the dreaded trench foot. The trenches of Europe are routinely filled with water from runoff or rain, and your feet are constantly submerged in muddy, fetid water. The water rots away at the flesh, and if you don't take enough care of them, you'll find yourself shipped back to the rear for a double amputation of feet. It's not easy, but you do your best to dry them as often as possible. Exhausted by your post-battle maintenance, though, it's finally time to retire for a few hours of sleep. You head into a small slit cut in the back of the trench, not much more than a hole in the earth that's your personal sleeping place. It's slightly elevated above the floor of the trench, so at least most of the water runs out and down to the trench floor. But while the French and Germans enjoy entire rooms cut into the earth, you don't get much more than this, a simple hole. For you, though, it's the height of luxury, and as your heavy eyes close, it's not long before you're fast asleep. You did it! You took the plunge, sorta literally, and joined the US Navy. Maybe it was for the college money, maybe you're just feeling patriotic, or maybe the Village People made a pretty compelling argument with their 1979 top 10 hit in the Navy. Either way, you're in it now. And congratulations, because you're getting a first-hand education on why living on an aircraft carrier sucks. As the Village People famously crooned, you can indeed sail the 7 seas in the Navy. But as soon as you get on board the carrier, you very quickly realize that you're going to be seeing very little of any sea. That's because you've been assigned to work below decks. And it's not long until you realize that American warships are no pleasure yachts or even tourist cruise liners. At about your 3rd day away from port, you finally have a bit of free time, and the thought hits you, you haven't seen the sun this entire time. You've always loved the ocean, and you loved reading stories about the great age of sail heroes who circumnavigated the world and faced raging storms, salt spray on their faces and raging gales tossing their hair about heroically. Except you haven't so much as tasted salt water, and the only breeze you're getting comes from the ship's air conditioning, which seems to always either be far too cold or not cool enough. You haven't glimpsed the sun since you came on board. What gives? You didn't sign up to be a submariner. Well, as you'll learn, the flight deck is pretty much off limits to anyone but a few authorized personnel. As an active runway at sea, it's pretty much the single most dangerous workplace in the world. At any moment, a million things could go wrong, and they have in the past. It's not long before you hear stories of arresting wires snapping and whipping across the flight deck, cutting off people's limbs who are unlucky enough to get caught in the path. With the job of holding back tens of thousands of pounds of force, it's no surprise that when these wires snap and there's always a risk of a break, they can be devastating for flight deck crew. Then there's the possibility of a fiery crash, and although you're happy to hear that the Navy hasn't suffered one of those in a very long time. Still, with jets flying in at over 100 miles per hour on a flight deck bucking with the ocean, things can and do go wrong. One misstep could see you accidentally run out in front of a fighter jet being catapulted off the deck. And well, there's always the possibility of being blown off the deck by the wind or the jet blast of a plane revving up for takeoff. It has happened. And with the flight deck being about 65 feet above the water, falling into the ocean from that height isn't going to give you great survival odds. So hanging out on the flight deck to take in some sunny weather just isn't going to be an option. In fact, there are very few places where you'll even be able to see daylight aboard your carrier. This is, after all, a warship. The bulkheads are meant to try to protect from explosive rounds and mitigate the damage of a missile attack, and portholes or windows make for terrible protection against either. You could try to hit up the bridge to get a nice 120-foot view of the ocean around you, but you'd better have some pretty serious security clearance to even be up there, or you'll very quickly be spending your enlistment in the brig. You decide you'll just have to make do with the vitamin D supplements the ship's doctors prescribed you, as you resign yourself to the fate of not seeing the sun again for weeks. As your first few days in your new Navy life wear on you though, something else starts to gnaw at you in the back of your head. Everything is so cramped all the time. The hallways are so narrow people often have to turn sideways to pass each other. And the stairs that go up or down different decks are so steep, it's like doing a round on a Stairmaster set to the highest difficulty, plus 10. Then it's very quickly dawning on you that this is a warship with one mission: kill bad guys and break their stuff. And everything about the ship is built around that mission. Crew and crew comforts are a very distant second. At least you're not hot bunking like they do on submarines though. Although in wartime that could change at a moment's notice. Aircraft carriers have in the past been used to ferry troops around, and that big flight line still needs to be kept clear for carrier operations, which means everyone below deck is going to be sharing everything, including bunks. In peacetime though, you generally don't have to worry about that, and you shudder to think about having to crawl in a bed recently shared by another crewmate, especially when you know that shower time is even more limited on a submarine than it is on a carrier. Your rack is small and number 3 in a stack of 3, itself in a bay full of 60 such racks. But at least it's your own, and it has a small sheet you can draw back for privacy. Well, as much privacy as you can possibly get knowing that there's 59 other sailors all around you. If the bunks are bad though, the toilet is a nightmare. Now, the Navy prides itself on discipline and orderliness, which means that the bathroom is never truly a disaster zone that it could be, but with a bathroom barely bigger than an airline bathroom being shared by dozens of guys at a time, it doesn't take much for disaster to strike. Plus, it's hard to always keep things clean with that many bums sitting on the same seat, back to back to back to back. Oh, and when it backs up due to a plumbing problem, well, let's not talk about what happens then. Once more, you're just grateful you aren't living on a submarine. At least each bay of 60 personnel has a common area with a TV hooked up to the ship's satellite system, so catching up on the latest shows isn't really a problem. Though with a crew of around 5,000 sailors, avoiding spoilers is all but impossible. There is also the galley nearest to your spot on the ship, and if everything else about living on a carrier can be quite difficult, at least the food is almost always excellent. Here, the Navy definitely knows what it's doing, and it learned long ago that good food means happy sailors, and happy sailors means less problems for the ship. And unfortunately, with deployments that can be several months long and replenishment of supplies being weeks apart, this also means that things like fresh fruit and vegetables can run out pretty fast. It's mostly frozen stuff for you and your fellow soldiers, but the cooks do a really good job of keeping the food warm and tasty. Smell is another thing you have to get used to, and every single day your nose is being assaulted by all manner of weird industrial smells. You soon realize that despite how badass they look, fighter jets are incredibly delicate machines, and after each flight an army of engineers pores over them to ensure that they stay in tip-top shape. Not surprising considering that jets literally fly around by channeling a constant explosion out their rear end. There's the smell of the various fluids used to lubricate, protect, and maintain these incredibly expensive and delicate fighting machines. Grease for joints, glue to make sure the delicate skin sensors remain affixed, antifreeze to keep the plane's guts working properly in sub-zero temperatures, and all matter of strange and very aromatic scents greet your nose every day. And this is of course just the planes. The carrier itself is nothing but a titanic machine that needs just as much careful love and attention. At least there's a movie theater on board and several gyms. Matter of fact, it looks like the sailors have taken the liberty of sticking exercise equipment in several places definitely not designed for it. The more you think about it, the more you realize that if there's one activity on board you'll always find a spot for, it's exercising. There's also girls to talk to, as they make up about 1/5 of the crew. One of them really old-timers tells you that the biggest change with allowing women to serve aboard combat ships is that the ship as a whole generally smells nicer, thanks to all the men suddenly feeling motivated to shower more often. You're excited for the opportunity to be a little flirtatious, anything to break up the monotony of your life at sea. But then you very quickly realize that the odds are very firmly stacked against you. And then, of the 1/5 of women, you have to navigate which ones are actually available and not married. You sigh as you resign yourself to your bunk once more. It's a good thing you brought an iPad with a bunch of books loaded digitally. It gives you something to do, and also your personal storage space consists of one shelf and a very thin locker. At least you'll be able to use the ship's internet to download new books frequently, and sometimes you can even order stuff to be delivered via mail to the ship. Being able to talk with people back home is a big plus too. As you lay in your bunk though, you can't help but shake one nagging thought from your head. If war were to break out, well, you'd be the first to know it because US carriers are always first on the scene, and if that war is against someone with any kind of Air Force or Navy, well, you'll also be the first to know because you'll be the first to be targeted. In fact, every potential military rival to the US, from Iran to China, has detailed plans in place to try and knock US carriers out with submarines, missiles, or any number of other systems. That's right, you've got a great big bullseye on your back. You're surfing on board the world's biggest, meanest ship, but also a total bullet magnet if war breaks out. And that's just one of the many reasons you're starting to learn that life aboard a carrier really, really sucks. With 72 submarines in service, the United States fields the largest underwater fighting force in the world. Stealthy and absolutely deadly against surface vessels, submarines are tasked with deterring foreign aggression, nuclear deterrence, intelligence gathering, and even providing fire support for land forces with land attack missiles. But for the most of a submarine's lifespan, it will glide through the oceans of the world completely undetected, and as they say, out of sight, out of mind. What is life like under the sea for those who man these secretive weapons of war, though? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at what life is like aboard a submarine. Just a quick note about a sponsor of this video, Skillshare. You're about to learn how sailors spend 90 days or more at a time out at sea. But if that was you and you had Skillshare, you could spend that time learning brand new skills or honing existing ones. Skillshare is an online learning community with over 20,000 classes in photography, video production, management, and more, all available online right now. The first 1,000 people to sign up by visiting the link in the description will receive 2 months of Skillshare absolutely free. Join Skillshare and start learning today. Now, let's get back to the video. Not every man can be a submariner, and though it is a 100% all-volunteer force, the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet has very stringent entry requirements. Individuals must be male, pass a series of academic tests, psychological evaluations, and intensive courses on the fundamentals of submarine operations. With deployments that can last for hundreds of days at a time, and disaster being only one mistake away, the Navy must be confident that it is entrusting some of the most expensive weapons in its arsenal and the 100+ lives within them to only the most psychologically stable and academically qualified individuals. But it isn't a life for everyone who applies. Technically, the US deploys submarines for about 90 days at a time, but the realities of a dynamic geopolitical environment sometimes means that submariners will be out at sea for 100 days or more, pulling into port only long enough to stock up on food reserves before putting out to sea again. One submariner interviewed by Task and Purpose said that his longest deployment was for 328 days. That's a long time spent inside a cramped metal tube underwater. As the US Navy only operates nuclear-powered submarines, each sub's endurance is based on the amount of food it can carry. The reactors will typically only be fueled once during the lifetime of a boat, and a need to keep its crew fed is the only thing that limits how long a submarine can stay out to sea for. Both air and water are regenerated internally, so even long after food runs out, a submarine will still provide fresh drinking water and breathable air. The submarine's crew is split up into 3 6-hour shifts each. Typically, a crew member will have 6 hours on duty, 6 hours of study, exercise, and private time, and 6 hours of sleeping time. This 18-hour day rotation can be disorienting for a crew who spends weeks at a time under the water, and typically crew members only know what time of day it actually is based off of what meal they're being served. Space is at an absolute premium on any submarine, so personal space is extremely limited. Every submariner has typically about 15 square feet to themselves and sleep in tiny bunks, affectionately or not called coffins. Inside your bunk, only a thin sheet of cloth separates you from the outside world, so privacy is nearly non-existent. And because somebody is always sleeping no matter the time of day, submariners have an unwritten rule to never slam doors and always keep volume down to a minimum. Some submariners, however, have more crew than bunk space, which leads to the much-hated practice of hot bunking, where 2 or more submariners share one bunk. As one prepares to start their shift, the other takes his place to get his 6 hours of sleep. Submarines, it seems, are definitely not places for anybody with privacy or personal space issues. Bunks aren't the only place with limited space. There's typically only 2 showers for the entire crew of up to 130 submariners, and a maximum showering time of 3 to 5 minutes is enforced. This not only helps ensure everyone who needs one can get a shower, but it also lessens the strain on the ship's water filtration system, which turns salty seawater into fresh water. There's also typically only a single dryer and washer aboard a submarine, making clean laundry a luxury. For entertainment, there is a tiny gym with typically 1 to 2 machines and free weights which the crew can use. Because space is at such a premium, rooms typically have double uses, and the gym may in fact be the torpedo room. The officer's wardroom, where senior officers dine, also serves as an operating theater during medical emergencies. Bathrooms are extremely limited as well, with typically only 1 bathroom per 40 men, and you'd better know how to use the toilet because waste has to be held in a special tank to be ejected at the appropriate time. The toilet has to be pressurized before you flush it, but operated improperly and it will shoot its contents backwards into your face. A rec room typically offers a plasma TV or 2 and a large selection of movies to keep the crew entertained. Video game systems are common, along with a small library of games, though the Navy makes cards and board games freely available to help sailors blow off steam and build camaraderie. The most space aboard a submarine is reserved for the nuclear reactor and the propulsion system, which alone take up about 1/3 of the sub's total length. The kitchen takes up the second most amount of space and is typically extremely well stocked. The US Navy knowing for decades that a well-fed crew is a happy crew. Life beneath the waves for weeks or even months at a time can be extremely stressful, and so the Navy makes sure its galleys are well stocked. Sailors can enjoy fresh ingredients for the first few weeks of deployment, though after that food is made from non-perishables. Even then though, chefs manage to whip up a variety of dishes from lasagna to lobster to prime rib, and a delicious dessert is always on hand. There is no internet aboard a submarine, and communication with the outside world is reserved for the rare instances that a sub surfaces. Because initiating communications can give away a sub's position, and stealth is the most valuable asset, submariners don't communicate much with the outside world. That means that submariners can go weeks or months without contacting family or loved ones, and must rely on the friendships they've developed on board. To make the cramped environment more tolerable for each other, submariners have additional unwritten rules, such as no talk of politics on board, although sports trash talk is acceptable if not encouraged. While all of the military branches are keen on traditions and rites of passage, none are as dedicated to their traditions or have as nuanced rites of passage as the Navy. Partly tradition and partly to help keep morale up, submariners enjoy a tradition of initiating new crew members on their first crossing of the equator, called crossing the line. Everyone who has already crossed the line is known as a shellback, and those who haven't are known as wogs, shorthand for polywogs. The polywogs must polish a set of red trash weights used to compact trash, and then wear them around their necks for a week before the crossing. Wogs are also given an M&M, which they must keep and defend as their pearl, ensuring that it stays on their person at all times. Upon crossing the equator, the shellbacks spray the wogs with water hoses and dunk them in cold water, which may or may not have been urinated in. Seamen are a strange sort. Then they are escorted to the wardroom, where the fattest submariner on board has been dressed in a baby's diaper and covered in whipped cream, vinegar, mayonnaise, pretty much every condiment available. And then the wog must place their pearl inside his belly button and retrieve it back with their mouth. From that day on, the wog is no more and is welcomed as a full-blown shellback. Strange rituals aside, strong camaraderie is what sets submariners apart from other sailors in the U.S. Navy. And when you're spending weeks at a time in a pressurized cylinder straining to hold back the weight of the ocean, it's understandable that you might need to let some steam off in some pretty creative ways. Because of the high stress of their jobs, submariners are often excused somewhat from the Navy's typical strict regulations on hair and facial hair, allowing short beards and longer than usual hair for the notoriously tightly clipped U.S. Armed Forces. Once rejoining the rest of the Navy by pulling into port, however, submariners must get the trimmers out and make sure they're back in regs. Life aboard a submarine is tough, a unique mental and physical challenge that not every sailor is cut out for, yet has been argued repeatedly by defense analysts across the U.S. The U.S. Navy's silent service is the most critical element of its national security, from maintaining nuclear deterrence to ensuring the good behavior of not-so-friendly nations by threatening swift and overwhelming retaliation. Submariners are the world's ultimate, if secretive, peacekeepers. The surviving Western Roman Empire is widely recognized as having fallen on the 4th of September, 476 AD, when Flavius Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus and declared himself ruler of all Italy. However, Rome had been largely in collapse for at least a century prior, and by the time of the last Roman emperor in the West, Rome existed more by name than fact. The collapse of Rome left a power vacuum across Europe, launching the continent into centuries of continuous warfare and cultural stagnation known as the Dark Ages. Hello and welcome to the Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at what a day in the life of the Dark Ages was like in ancient England. England, or Britannia as it was known back then, had been only partially conquered by the Romans, who limited their advance at the famed Hadrian's Wall. The Romans never fully subjugated the local tribe, so with the fall of Rome, Britannia became a lawless, free-for-all land of opposing warlords and self-declared kings. For these early rulers, their kingdoms and right to rule extended only so far as their soldiers could reach, and the hapless peasants caught in the middle would often find themselves forced to pay taxes and tribute to separate rulers who claimed their lands as their own. Governments didn't exist at this time, and government services didn't consist of much more than armed soldiers coming by your door to demand taxes. With the collapse of Rome, the entire European continent experienced an economic crash, and major industries such as pottery making and construction all but disappeared overnight. Without a strong centralized government to print coins and enforce monetary policy, civilization across Europe returned back to bartering, and taxes were collected in the form of trade goods, food, or even physical service in the Lord's army. Feudalism eventually began to take root in its most primitive form, with local lords granting parcels of land to favored soldiers, typically cavalrymen, as these elite soldiers of the era were much valued for their horses since trained war horses became much rarer. When a local lord died, there were often no clear lines of succession, prompting all-out war between the king's surviving family and other feuding nobles. Religion continued to spread across Europe. Judaism and Islam competed with paganistic beliefs, but the young and still growing Christian faith quickly garnered support across the continent. The example of Jesus standing up to authoritarian Jewish elders in the New Testament resonated particularly well with peasants currently under the heel of brutal lord. However, the clergy was not truly organized yet, and the authority of the church, which was still based primarily in Italy, was not fully recognized as far north as Britain. different brands of Christianity appeared, leading to interfaith conflict and further dividing the population. The clergy was starting to emerge as a separate social class, but they remained mostly independent from each other or any centralized control structure. These early Christians helped to preserve a great amount of ancient texts and knowledge that may have been lost forever to rampaging barbarians, securing Roman books and manuscripts with their growing monasteries. Life for the average peasant was difficult, dangerous, and tough. With the collapse of industry, most people worked as sustenance farmers, growing enough to feed themselves and trade just enough excess for needed goods such as metal tools. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were staple crops of the time, and they were supplemented by beans and peas. Apples, plums, berries, and various nuts were eaten when in season, though the primary diet of a Dark Ages peasant was various cereal crops ground into flour and made into bread. Locally caught fish and sometimes even deer or wild boar were an occasional treat, but animal proteins were rare, with sheep raised for their wool and milk and beef being too pricey for most people. People also consumed large quantities of very weak ale, as most drinking water was unsafe. Though popularized by myths, mead was actually a very rare drink enjoyed mostly only by the elite. Skilled craftsmen such as blacksmiths were extremely rare and highly valued, and the merchant or craftsman guilds of the Middle Ages did not exist yet. Education was all but non-existent, with typically only the clergy having the ability to read. Most nobles were illiterate. Farmers not only worked the lands, but they would also often be called up into military service during non-harvest times, with most lords using conscripted armies rather than full-time professional soldiers. Medicine in the Dark Ages consisted mostly of herbal remedies known as wort cunning in England. Practices such as leeching to remove bad blood from an individual and superstitious use of magical remedies prospered, and sadly most ailments became fatal. Yet some of the foundations of real medicine were being rediscovered after the extinction of the Roman healing arts, with medical treatments for things such as styes involving onion, garlic, wine, and various other ingredients containing very effective antibiotic and antibacterial properties. Rudimentary surgeries were also taking place. An 11th century skull discovered in the Warham Percy medieval village showed that a heavy blow to the head had been treated by cutting away part of the bone in the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. With the discovery of anesthesia over a millennia away, we don't care to consider just how painful such a procedure may have been. Across Europe, the fall of Rome had seen people return to a mostly isolated lifestyle, with most people living in small communities or farmsteads. Yet major cities and establishments did survive, and settlements such as those near modern York even exploded in population. These primitive cities were fairly squalid by modern comparisons, with none of that famed Roman plumbing or luxuries such as public baths and waterworks. Refuse in the form of trash, dung, and rotting timber were discarded directly into the streets, and deposits built up at a rate of roughly 1 inch a year. In these horrible conditions, parasites and disease proliferated, and the average life expectancy was a shocking 31 years. Violence, disease, and poor nutrition all created a very high infant mortality rate. But if a child was one of the lucky few who made it to 20 years, he or she could typically expect to live into his or her 40s. Life in the Dark Ages was often short, brutal, and fraught with hardships. The fall of Rome created a power and cultural identity vacuum within a continent that had for centuries identified itself solely as Roman. And with Rome gone, vengeful barbarians rampaged across the bones of the empire and effectively stamped out the last remnants of Roman society, including its economy, law and order, and scientific knowledge. Yet the Dark Ages didn't completely stop the development of human civilization, as it's so often believed. Outside of Europe, life continued on relatively unchanged, with mighty eastern kingdoms rising and falling and the influence of the Islamic Caliph expanding across Africa and the Middle East. But for the average peasant of Dark Age Britannia, life remained a struggle for survival. Families had to fight to produce enough food to feed themselves, while often being brutalized by competing warlords or self-appointed lords. There must be a time in a royal child's life when their parents take the child to one side and say something like, "Darling, you're not like normal people. Life will be different for you. You are royal." They then proceed to tell the kid what being royal means, with the youngster receiving a kind of Royalty 101 course. They're told that they won't mix with the public like the other kids. There will be no dating the hoi polloi, and they'll spend much of their public life surrounded by bodyguards. They'll also soon understand that they are fabulously wealthy, astoundingly privileged, but with that that comes a lot of negatives, such as being hounded by the media forevermore. Now let's see what else goes on in the life of a young royal. The first thing that a royal child has to get used to is being on show, and that will last a lifetime. When you look at the princes William and Harry in the UK, their lives have continually been photographed. We imagine at some point they're going to ask their parents why they have to sit around being photographed all the time, and we expect when they ask that the Royalty 101 course will be delivered. Okay, so now they get it. Life is different for them. What next? Well, they'll have to go to school. In the meantime, because their parents will have all kinds of royal duties, these royal kids will spend a lot of time with the nannies. We found in the British media an article that talked about a place called Norland College, a place where it said the British royals have got their nannies from for years. Make no mistake, the nannies from here will be a big part of a young royal's life. Looking after a royal kid is kind of a big deal, and so it seems that to get through Norland College, you'll have to pass a lot of tests, study child psychology, do a lot of training, and believe it or not, they even have some martial arts training and are taught about threats by British military intelligence officers. A royal kid is going to spend a lot of time with these well-spoken, intelligent, tough women. They will then have to start school, but do they go to just any school? It seems the young royals do hang out with some boisterous kids. When Prince William was just 8 years old, he had to go to a hospital after being whacked on the head by another kid wielding a golf club. At that time, the Associated Press wrote, Prince William, the 8-year-old who is second in line to the British throne, underwent surgery for a skull fracture after being hit by a golf club while playing with schoolmates. With that in mind, these kids do interact, and it seems they're not always mollycoddled. But if you read the story, you'll hear the accident happened when the kids were playing on the school putting green. How many schools for children these days have their own putting greens? The answer is not many. And royals don't just go to the local primary school with the working class kids from down the street. We doubt they return home from school each day to a plate of baked beans on toast and then rush out for a game of street soccer. William went to a place called Jane Minor's Nursery School. The New York Times wrote about this place when William was there and said it was not particularly an exclusive school, although the then $1,000 a year cost was likely more than most Brits could afford. That's about $2,300 a year with inflation. The future king stayed there until he was 5. After that, he attended something called a pre-preparatory school. This is called Wetherby School, and it's located in Notting Hill, London. From what we gathered, getting into this place isn't that easy because it's based on having your child's name on the list. We expect this place is kind of exclusive. If you want to send your kids there now, you'll have to pay about $10,000 a term. William stayed there until he was 8. After that, William attended an all-boys boarding school, and this place was called Ludgrove School. Right now, it costs over $11,000 a term to study there. The place has been criticized in the past as being a home for snobs, and if you look at the list of former pupils, you'll find lots of royals and members of the aristocracy. Life at this school, we expect, was slightly different from British comprehensive schools. We know that because it said William was rather fond of clay pigeon shooting while he was there. Inner-city London schools don't generally have shooting on the list of activities. And then he ended up at what's called one of the most prestigious schools in the world, called Eton College. If you're rich and posh and come from an elite family, this is where you might end up. It costs around $50,000 a year to send your child to this boarding school, and you can be sure the child will be rubbing shoulders with some of Britain's future leaders in terms of politics and business. One former student said this about the school: "My mom's family for like 3 generations have gone there. My dad absolutely hated the idea of me going there because he was like, this is the paragon of everything that's elitist and awful about England. I was the last year, I think, where you could still be signed up at birth. You literally would get put down at birth for a certain house. You get the picture. As for how Prince Harry fit in, one former student said he integrated well. He also said Harry was a couple of years above me, I think. They made a big effort to seem like he was a normal person. Obviously, he was from the royal family, but I think the school and all the people there wanted to make him feel included. But Prince Harry did have bodyguards when he went out in London and partied. The Queen would also sometimes end up at Eton to visit the boys, and the other kids would be like, hey, it's your grandmother, the Queen. Suffice it to say, those royal kids grew up knowing they were entitled, and they no doubt spoke in a coded language used by the elite. They embraced old traditions and at times wore top hats, and we very much doubt ever received a punch in the face by the school bully. To conclude this section, the royal child will likely only mix with children from very wealthy families. That child will board at school a lot and so spend a lot of time away from his family. On top of that, the child will travel a lot with his family and also spend a lot of time with carers. It could feel like a lonely life being away from family so much. At the same time, these kids will spend money. When Harry went out to those nightclubs, he had to pay for stuff. We found one report that said the royal kids don't really perceive money the way other kids do, because when they want it, they get it. Saying that, it's reported that Princess Diana wanted William and Harry to know the value of money. She discovered that her husband, Prince Charles, didn't really know what a pound was actually worth until he was a teenager. If you want something, you just ask, and so that might affect a royal child's conception of what money is worth. Then there's the stress of being a royal. Okay, so you might be thinking having money on tap is a good thing, or never having to stress out about being poor or making it in the world. But if that's all you know, things iron out. It becomes relative. You can still feel down. Those kids at some point will realize that their actions are continually under the microscope. At some point, Prince William realized he was the future King of England, and he had to act the part. There's little room for error as a royal child, although Prince Harry has been wayward at times. Harry said he would almost explode at times with the pressure, and he regularly suffered from bouts of depression and anxiety. He told the press as an adult, "I just didn't know what was wrong with me." There must come a time when the royal child grows up and becomes much more self-aware. The child will realize he lives in a bit of a mad world. In the words of Prince Harry, "I can safely say that losing my mom at the age of 12 and therefore shutting down all of my emotions for the last 20 years has had a quite serious effect on not only my personal life, but my work as well. And no matter how many friends you make, you'll always be a royal, and people will treat you differently. Most of you watching this will have best friends, people who you can rely on to treat you like an equal. But for a royal kid, there must always be the sense of being separated. It's the same for royals everywhere. Imagine being the former king of Thailand, Bhumibol Adulyadej. He's now deceased, but after living in Europe and the US when he was still young, he became the king of Thailand with a whole country looking up to him. He had to grow up very fast and was even treated like a god. There's some pressure when you're being seen as godly. While a prince or princess will be surrounded with people offering them good advice, they will forever feel the pressure of what they were born into. There will be many things they will know and will never be able to talk about publicly. The royal child will have a long list of secrets, and that will weigh heavily on that child. There will be plenty of scandals surrounding the royal child's life, and they will, for the most part, take the truth to the grave with them. So while being a royal child may at times look like a lot of fun, we imagine it's very stressful. These kids might have dreams, but in some ways they'll have to do what they're told to do. They might only want to backpack around the world, but that's never gonna happen. Well, not with the freedom other backpackers have. They might just once want to go to the movie theater and hold hands with someone, but that won't happen unless bodyguards are around and the movie theater has been checked out first. The role is inescapable, and as a child, this royal might be thinking, "I never asked for any of this," but that won't appease the many anti-royals from wanting them removed from their house, paid for by taxpayers. We imagine some of the best times would be when the kids don't even realize their royalty, but once they get to grips with it, it could be quite tiresome. Prince Harry once said, "To be honest, dinner conversations were the worst bit about being a child and listening to the boring people around me." It seems the royal shoe just didn't fit well for young Harry. Then again, Queen Elizabeth said despite what they are, the royals do live a normal life too. She said, "Like all the best families, we have our share of eccentricities, of impetuous and wayward youngsters, and family disagreements." Another British royal who's been in the spotlight as of late has been Prince Andrew. We're going to stand on the fence regarding the truth about what he did, but we might ask if growing up as a royal gives that person a feeling that they can get away with anything. If you watched his controversial interview with the BBC, you'll know how he came across. He didn't seem to feel guilty about being a friend of a man who had caused so much damage. He seemed to have little to no empathy regarding the victims. You can also read a lot into what he said about going to a Pizza Express in Woking. It seems he thinks he's above visiting a pizza restaurant where the normal people go. So we imagine that while being a royal might be hard, some royals might believe they're above the normal folks. Studies have revealed that wealthy people and sometimes celebrities can indeed feel as though they're above the law. And we guess when you grew up in a royal family, you'll have this sense of immunity. So while we've been quite sympathetic in today's show about growing up a royal, we imagine that some royals take advantage of their wealth and power and go to what we might call the dark side. Despite what Gerard Butler's glistening six-pack and billowing cape might indicate in the movie 300, it turns out life as a Spartan warrior was actually kind of terrible. Though life was undoubtedly worse in ancient times on almost all levels, health, longevity, and hygiene, warriors in the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta might have had it worst of all. Why? We sent our reluctant researchers back to ancient times to find out. You might think that hell for Spartan warriors started during the intense military training when they were young men. or perhaps even teenagers, and you'd be wrong. First of all, boys in Sparta were destined to become warriors from the start. No one was asking them about their hopes and dreams or aspirations of starring in Euripides' new play when they were growing up. There was only one permissible occupation: soldier, otherwise known as hoplite in ancient Sparta. This meant that Spartan babies had to prove their fitness right out of the womb. Both boys and girls were inspected for signs of good strength, health, and any physical defects as soon as they were born. A myth persisted for centuries that babies who didn't pass this inspection were tossed into a gorge at the foot of Mount Taygetus. Most historians now believe this to be untrue. Instead, the infants were abandoned on a hillside to die of exposure. So, that's not much better. Occasionally, someone would come by and rescue a baby, but at the end of the day, the point is that the jaundice that kept you in the NICU a bit longer would have been a death sentence in ancient Sparta. The babies that were lucky enough to make it through, and we use that term lucky lightly as there's a whole lot of insanity waiting for them, were bathed in wine to prove that they were in fact strong. That's a lot of strength tests so far for children who cannot walk. When they cried out for attention or to get their needs met, Spartan parents would often ignore their children or purposely put them in dark, isolated spaces so they learned to handle them. We assumed that there was no ancient Spartan version of CPS. After infants had gotten all that pesky teething and learning to walk out of the way, the boys were placed in a strict military educational program at the ripe old age of 7. The program would last a whopping 13 years and was known as agoge. Boys were taken from their families and housed in communal barracks. They were instructed in warfare, hunting, athletics, and more scholastic education such as reading, writing, and poetry. At age 12, when most of us were battling with braces or acne for the first time, Spartan boys had all their clothing taken from them and were forced to sleep outside. They were only handed a red cloak, so it turned out that 300 was accurate in many ways, except that Spartans almost never moved in slow motion. The boys then had to make their beds out of reeds and whatever other material they found in nature. In order to further prepare them for the horrors and scarcities of the battlefield, their elders would encourage them to scavenge for food and steal if necessary. However, if they were caught stealing food, they would be mercilessly flogged or beaten, which is kind of the exact thing the phrase "damned if you do, damned if you don't" was invented for. The point of this, theoretically, as we're making that generous assumption here that the Spartan elders weren't just abusive sociopaths, was to toughen up the boys to withstand the cold, pain, and hunger on the battlefield. However, it wasn't enough to just make them endure such situations. The elders who taught them decided that they needed to instigate further problems as well. Spartan boys in the barracks were often encouraged to fight each other and participate in hazing of their fellow soldiers in training. Apparently, encouraging a spirit of camaraderie wasn't high on the Spartan priority list. Anyone who showed signs of fear or nervousness was especially targeted for ridicule. In fact, occasionally the girls in town who were undergoing their own rigorous training programs at home would sing in choruses at formal ceremonies in front of Spartan elders and dignitaries, and in their songs they would single out boys underperforming in the program to make fun of them. Yeah, imagine that girl you have a crush on in elementary school coming up with a song that she performs in front of the principal and the rest of your classmates about that time you had an accident in first grade and how much of a wuss you are. Oh, and also, you're not in elementary school so much as your life is the Hunger Games. Pretty terrifying, huh? Last of all, before the teens became men, was the diamastigosis. This was also known as the contest of endurance, in which teen boys were taken to the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, placed in front of the altar, and flogged, sometimes to death. Though the practice originated as a religious ritual and a test of the boys' pain tolerance, it eventually became a grisly sport and a kind of tourist attraction. By the 3rd century AD, the town had constructed an amphitheater around the sanctuary so visitors could observe the boys being flogged. So the boys went through their teen years learning that their elders would use pretty much any excuse in the book to abuse them. What happened once they reached the ripe old age of 20 and their primary education finished? Though the toughest part of the training was done, the hardships for a Spartan soldier were far from over once he reached adulthood. When men reached the age of 20, they started attending a type of mess hall known as sousitia. The men were purposefully given bland, flavorless, and small rations so they could learn to cope with hunger. Soldiers were expected to be fully devoted to their physical fitness via training and diet. In fact, any Spartan citizens who were overweight were not only publicly ridiculed, but could even be banished from Sparta for their weight. Basically, imagine if body shaming became a state-sponsored pastime. While the philosophers and artists of Athens would drink wine, eat heartily, and talk about life and culture, Spartan men kept their wine intake to a minimum. They would shame and punish teens for becoming drunk. To show the ill effects of intoxication, they would frequently make the members of the enslaved class, the helots, drink to excess, then parade them around the mess halls. This would be a good time to mention the people who were making Spartan society run while the local Spartan men participated in military training and child abuse. After all, both the Spartan army and the Spartan farms required skilled laborers and craftsmen to be productive. These jobs fell to the perioeci, free non-citizens from the surrounding areas of Laconia. The more labor-intensive jobs were assigned to the Helots, a class of enslaved fellow Greeks who made up most of Spartan's population. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans, who could become equal citizens, or homoioi. Though the exact numbers vary over time, according to Herodotus in 479 BC, Helots outnumbered Spartan men by 7-1. In fact, part of the reason the Spartans kept such a well-trained army is to fend off constant threats of revolts from the Helots. Not having an enslaved class in the first place and then not having to abuse your children either might have been the better solution to all this, but what's done is done. The Helots unfortunately factor into one of the last components of a Spartan warrior's training as well. After the soldiers entered their 20s, the most skilled among them were organized into Krypteia. Their mentors would give them daggers and a few essential supplies, and they were ordered to roam the roads and countryside day and night to find and murder Helots at will. This served the double purpose of preparing the Spartan soldiers to kill others on the battlefield, while also thinning out the Helot population so too many of them wouldn't band together and revolt. Though some Athenians and other Greeks criticized the practice as unimaginably cruel, which we would have thought would be self-evident, many Spartans saw it as a noble tradition. Plato described what a Spartan man named Megillus thought of the Krypteia. Krypteia, as it's often called, affords a wonderfully severe training in hardihood, as the men go barefoot in winter and sleep without coverlets and have no attendants, but wait on themselves and rove through the whole countryside both by night and by day. Megillus's description makes it sound like a coming-of-age outdoor adventure rather than the brutal killing spree that it was, which perhaps gives us an idea of how much Spartans accepted violence against the Helots. Now that we've seen how Spartan warriors were punished, underfed, abused, left out in the cold, and then asked to become serial killers, let's turn to a subject that might have been a source of happiness for them: love. Hey, life might have sucked in all other respects for a Spartan warrior, but they must have found some solace in their relationships, right? Well, for those in the audience who haven't caught on by now, pretty much every aspect of Spartan warriors' lives was a catch-22 for which they could be punished. See, Spartan men were encouraged to marry in their 20s, so much so that men who hadn't found a wife by their late 20s were ridiculed. After all, the primary goal of the Spartan state was to create a more healthy young soldier, so how could that happen if men and women waited too long to marry? Yet, even though marriage was encouraged, communal living in military barracks didn't end until age 30, when Spartan soldiers were considered full citizens. This meant that though they were usually married for several years before turning 30, they would have to sneak out at night to visit their wives and be intimate with them. Even on their wedding night, Spartan men were expected to be back at the barracks before dawn. This was to further emphasize the point that a Spartan soldier's primary loyalty should be to his city-state, even more so than to his own family. The wedding night itself was incredibly bizarre through our modern lens, or really any lens of any living person at any time. The night of their weddings, wives would shave their heads and dress in a man's cloak and sandals. Not exactly the sexy honeymoon outfit one might think of. They would then be left in either a dark room in their homes or in the husband's barracks, sources mention both, and wait for their new husband to pretend to kidnap them. The marriage would then be presumably consummated once everyone was clearly in the mood from all that incredible head shaving and kidnapping the night provided. Why dress like men and shave their hair, you might wonder? Here is where we get to somewhat controversial part of the history of ancient Sparta. While teenage boys were in the agoge program, they almost always had an older mentor in his 20s training them, educating them, and guiding them into adulthood. There's plenty of evidence that some of those relationships were sexual in nature, though the extent to which this happened is highly debated. Either way, any physical relationship was supposed to stop when a boy became an adult, so the exact opposite of our consent laws today. Some historians have posited that newlywed wives dressed as men in order to help Spartans make the transition from sleeping with men to women. This is contested by others who argue that while Spartan boys did shave their hair in their early teen years, Spartan men took pride in wearing their hair long after that. So the wives shaving their hair for this reason wouldn't make much sense. Any case, throw possible sexual assault into the mix as one of the many things Spartan warriors might have had to deal with. Now, let's say this military training is finally done. A Spartan boy has miraculously made it through multiple tests and abuses he's had to suffer through from birth to age 30, and is now a full citizen of Sparta, with his own home, wife, and land. Surely things must get better from here on out. Well, sorta. Those Spartan soldiers did get farmland that was helpfully maintained by those poor Helots. They were on reserve duty as soldiers until age 60. They were even expected to eat meals with their fellow soldiers and spent a lot of time in the barracks, even after they were no longer required to live there. Each Spartan soldier had a bronze helmet, a breastplate, round shield made of bronze and wood, a sword, and a long spear. The shield is important, as it features in perhaps one of the most well-known phrases to come out of Sparta: "Return with your shield or on it." Supposedly, this was what mothers said to their sons before sending them off to war. As usual, Sparta was all about the tough love. In essence, this meant that a Spartan soldier was expected to return victorious and, if not, at least dead or gravely injured. Surrendering during a battle was considered an abject disgrace, and most of the Spartan men who did this either ended up killing themselves or fighting to the death in a later battle to redeem themselves. So, even in adulthood, a Spartan soldier was expected to focus most of his life on fighting, and then expected to either win or die in each battle. Considering how war-prone Spartans were, this didn't bode well for the average soldier's life expectancy. If, and we want to highly emphasize that if, a Spartan soldier made it to the age of 60, he was officially considered retired and would be able to honorably withdraw from the army in any future battles. At this age, he had a chance of joining the Council of Elders, known as the Gerousia, meaning that after a lifetime of abuse, he might spend a couple of years as a politician before dying. That is, assuming he made it to 60 in the first place. Between war, hunger, and disease, this was an unlikely proposition at best. It's been dubbed a utopia, and a place most of us will be unable to avoid in the years to come. It will change your life in so many ways. But is that such a good thing? What actually is the Metaverse? It's a word people keep on hearing these days, yet we doubt many folks actually know what it is. One of the most outspoken proponents of the Metaverse is that chap that looks and acts a bit like a cyborg, the man named Mark Zuckerberg. He even changed his company name to Meta, so it seems his hopes are riding high on us all getting on board with his idea of a tech utopia. When he refers to this place, the new kind of tech universe, he's really only talking about a large cyberspace where immersion in our technology will allow us to be more connected than ever before. But how could we possibly be more connected than we already are? It will mean more virtual and augmented reality in our lives. For instance, in the Metaverse, you'd have an avatar, and that avatar could interact with other avatars. Let's say you have a meeting online. That could look like a bunch of avatars having a meeting, but they would interact with each other in a very realistic-looking environment. The point is to make you feel the virtual reality is real. You've probably seen something like this in the tech dystopia series Black Mirror. One or a few of those episodes shows people living in this other world more than the real world. At times, they gain points for the things they do in the Metaverse. Sometimes you're motivated to do these things because there's a payoff. We call this gamification. You've already seen things close to that, like when you get badges for using certain tech. The reward is supposed to keep you going back to the application or page. Shows others how great you are. In the Metaverse, you'll never stop competing to gain more points. You might also gain other virtual items, and those can be traded, sold, or given away on various platforms. In a true Metaverse, you'd have the ability to trade with anyone. This avatar of yours will be able to interact with other avatars across all platforms. Hence, you'd be in the Metaverse. Sounds like fun, huh? But just keep watching. We think by the end of the show, you'll think twice about signing up to the Metaverse. So basically, the Metaverse is a way to immerse ourselves more in tech using applications used in tandem with virtual and augmented reality devices. You become part of this other world, just like you do in some games such as The Sims. But this time, it's not just a game, it's your life. Let's say you work from home, and like us at the infographic show, you have a bunch of people working together that rarely see each other, if at all. When you have meetings, a bunch of virtual characters get together. Maybe when you do something good, your virtual character gets a virtual pat on the back in the form of a virtual reward that can be exchanged for something of value in the real world. These virtual offices, we are told, are the future of work. Hell, virtual schools could be the future. Microsoft is already in on this. In 2022, it will release Mesh for Microsoft Teams, which will mean holograms meeting in virtual spaces for work. You might think, well, I have Slack and I have email and I have Zoom, so why the hell do I need a virtual guy in a virtual office? Good question. Microsoft says there will be a feeling of presence when you use Mesh. Your avatar is going to make you feel like you're really there. It will be just like being with people, but not quite. Let's say the infographic show boss, along with the writers and editors, want to talk about why our Metaverse video was so popular and why the writer is so darn cool. In the normal world, that would sometimes mean sending files to certain people or chatting within an application, but all we'll ever see is a name and some text or maybe a video. For Microsoft, that's not good enough. The company thinks people will work a lot better and be more creative if all the avatars discuss ideas in this virtual world. Here are some selling points Microsoft offers. Connect with new depth and dimension. Engage with eye contact, facial expressions, and gestures. Your personality shines as technology fades away. This common understanding ignites ideas, sparks creativity, and forms powerful bonds. Wow, it sounds fab. Now I can't wait to become an avatar and gossip at the virtual water fountain with the other infographic show employees. Looking, as usual, like leaked data from Star Trek, Mark Zuckerberg outlined what he thought the metaverse would be in a video. As always, Zucks used a lot of flowery language regarding us being closer together in a world of greater richness. We'll be able to feel present, he explained. Like we're right there with the people no matter how far apart we actually are. He talked about the joyful, completely immersive way we'll communicate. Just listening to him felt like taking a hit of virtual heroin. He mentioned that with the help of headsets and other tech, when we share videos, we'll feel like we're in the room with the people in the video. When we play a game, we'll feel like we're in the game itself, not just looking at it on a screen. When Charlie Brooker wrote Black Mirror, he had already seen this world, but for him it was a nightmare. It was everything that's wrong with the world. Like a 19th century British poet, rather than be more out of this world, Brooker would say we should be getting closer to nature. Still, according to Zuckerberg, the metaverse isn't about spending more time looking at screens, but having a better experience when we use our devices. He failed to mention that some of his applications have been called digital opiates, even by some former Facebook employees. As usual, he didn't talk much about how much money he'll make. He wants you more connected, which will mean spending more money in his universe and making Zucks richer than he already is. The fact is, this more immersive world will make you more addicted. Back in 2011, writing for the New York Times, the technophobe novelist Jonathan Franzen wrote about the issue of us becoming addicted to tech. At the time, he obviously didn't know about the metaverse, but we think he saw one coming. Here's a snippet from that article. To speak more generally, the ultimate goal of technology, the telos of techna, is to replace a natural world that's indifferent to our wishes, a world of hurricanes and hardships and breakable hearts, a world of resistance, with a world so responsive to our wishes as to be effectively a mere extension of the self. You see, you won't have to be yourself in the metaverse, you'll be replaced by an avatar, and that avatar, as Franzen says, won't experience some of those very human things we feel in the real world. At first, this will feel great for you, you'll settle right in, but then one day you'll find yourself wanting to stay in this place of the easy streets and forego reality. As Franzen wrote, the verb to like on social media has changed from a state of mind to an action that you perform with your computer mouse, from a feeling to an assertion of consumer choice. You yourself will dedicate your time to being liked in this virtual world, creating an unreal character, and this won't make you happy. No longer will you laugh at meetings at work, but your character will laugh. Will you really feel like laughing? We guess some of you are thinking, well, this sounds pretty good actually. Maybe you're comparing Jonathan Franzen to one of those Luddite folks from England who went around factories during the Industrial Revolution, smashing up machines because they didn't like the idea of machines replacing them. You're thinking that the metaverse is just an extension of the internet that will undoubtedly help you buy more things, and it might just help you become more productive when you work. It will enable you to look at someone's video of a concert online, and then you can use your avatar to feel like you're at the concert too. It sounds great, and Franzen you think is a snob from another age. According to an article in Forbes, the metaverse is undoubtedly coming, no matter how many people like Franzen warn us of how dangerous it will be. The writer for that Forbes article rightly finished the story saying, side effects unknown. You're spending a hell of a lot of time sitting in a room wearing a headset that might not be a great thing for your well-being. You spending much more time on the internet than you already do may not turn out all hunky-dory. In fact, your online life might take up most of your real life. Do you really need that? You will waste away on the couch like a rotten apple in a compost heap. You will not be able to stop. Whoever owns the metaverse owns you. It will be more powerful than a drug, more addictive than TV, more alluring than an oasis in a time of great thirst. And it'll have you running on a virtual treadmill and attending your friend's funeral from 50 miles away. And oh, how you shed so many virtual tears. Now let's talk about love. Let's face it, we all need a little bit of love in our lives. Did you know that since the advent of dating apps, such as Tinder, fewer people are actually in long-term relationships? Vox magazine writes that consumerism has hijacked courtship. Instead of dating, you consume photographs within an app. Many people spend a lot of time on apps chatting with someone they won't actually meet. Hey, if they don't meet you face-to-face, they'll never know you used a photo editor to transform your imperfect face. And they won't know that in real life you stutter a little bit. It's safer staying your distance, but in the end, this relationship is completely unfulfilling. That's likely one reason why so many young people are so depressed these days. Now imagine how dating and love would be transformed if Zuckerberg is right. What if in the metaverse you really feel like you're with someone else when you're both just avatars? Will you ever take the risk of meeting face-to-face? As the writer for Vox says, when you spend time in the unreal world with someone else, there's a loss of connection with your own emotions, which is sad, because emotional connection is supposed to be the point of dating. Unlike in real life, in the metaverse you'll gain rewards for dating and gain more points for buying something for your date. You become a product, one that's reviewed and one that goes to great lengths to accrue more points. Your point score might actually attract more people to you, and those with fewer points might have to sit on the proverbial shelf, while in real life, good old-fashioned dating is much more complex than that. You'll become a slave in the metaverse, doing things just to amass more points so you can impress someone and perhaps one day give them a virtual hug. Maybe when you go to one of those virtual offices, you can receive virtual compliments about getting to first base with a bunch of ones and zeros. All the time, when you're virtually dating and maybe buying stuff online for your virtual lover, you're spending virtual currency, and guess who who gets a cut of every transaction. Mr. Zuckerberg, of course. So no wonder he looks over the moon with the Metaverse. That's not to mention that in the Metaverse, everything you do is surveilled. For God's sake, don't curse or blaspheme or speak your mind and offend someone, because that could get you locked out of many of the places you'd want to be. In the Metaverse, there are rules, and you, my friends, will abide by them. That's why the Metaverse will be a constellation of boring drones, not real people who have nuance to their personalities. And what'll happen to all those people who can't even afford to be in the Metaverse? They'll be like pariahs forsaken by the tech gods. They'll be virtually homeless, and don't think they'll be employable if they're not in the Metaverse. Employers will want to see your score. They'll require your Metaverse handle. For Zuckerberg, the Metaverse is a utopia, and it might be for a man that has about as much a personality as a plug. The Metaverse will exploit the vulnerable, the lonely, and the weak. We doubt Zuckerberg really thinks this way, though. He's just in a position to monopolize your weakness. To use Facebook parlance, Zuckerberg is in the process of mounting a coordinated attack to devour your existence. He said as much when he claimed the Metaverse will be the place where people will live, work, and play. We don't need more isolation. The COVID-19 lockdowns were proof that isolation makes us depressed, and for some, hit the bottle or the prescription mind meds. Good mental health depends on our close relationships with others. Virtuality is no replacement for reality. In the Metaverse, we will suffocate under an avalanche of merciless terabytes if we are careless enough to try and surf this bottomless web of enticing nonsense. As a pundit on technology told the BBC about the Metaverse, it's a bad idea, and the fact we are all sitting and looking at this like it's normal should be alarming everyone. It's not normal, it's everything science fiction has told you to be worried about. Who wouldn't want to have the superpowers like one of the Avengers? Imagine having the strength to fight off any bully, or the speed to never be late anywhere ever again. How about the power to read or manipulate minds? Or maybe just be tough enough to withstand any blow? Superpowers seem like a win-win, and you'd have to be out of your mind to pass up the chance to be as powerful as one of the Avengers. But maybe superpowers aren't all they're cracked up to be, and if given the chance to be bitten by a radioactive spider, maybe you should give it a hard pass. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at why it would suck to have superpowers like the Avengers. Super strength. Imagine having the brute strength of Thor, able to smash through just about anything and topple the biggest baddie with just one blow. You never have to take any guff from a bully ever again. And with your super strength, you could walk the streets at night unafraid of any petty street criminal. Winning sporting events would be a breeze, and you could score big in Vegas fighting as a professional boxer or a UFC fighter. As long as you kept the true extent of your strength a secret, of course. Nobody wants to fight a superhero. But having super strength comes with a super responsibility, and with some pretty crippling drawbacks. First is the most obvious. You'd have to constantly control just how much strength you exert on a daily basis. When you move to pick up a glass, the brain has to estimate what the correct amount of force to apply is in order to achieve a firm but not overly firm grip. We've all experienced brief lapses of concentration where we definitely apply more force than what we meant to, and with super strength, that might mean shattering a glass accidentally or perhaps shattering every bone in a person's hand. There's also moments where we react in passion, such as when we hug something we find adorable overly tight, or perhaps when we're overly aggressive with our affections. With normal human strength, this isn't much of a big deal, but with superhuman strength, you being a bit too aggressive in backing your lover up against a wall to kiss them could end up with you putting them through the wall instead. Hug your cat Muffins a bit too tight because of the cuteness overload, and you'll end up turning Muffins into sausage. Then there's involuntary reactions or muscle movements. A normal sneeze can exit the body at approximately 35 miles per hour, but a super sneeze could end up blowing away anyone directly in front of you. Get into an itchy nose sneezing fit, and you could end up blowing down several walls, Big Bad Wolf style. Ever go to a haunted house and accidentally flail out at an employee jumping out to scare you? Too bad for that employee, because with super strength, you'll be knocking their head clean off their body. Next time a friend runs a practical joke on you, it'll be that friend's last day on Earth. Super speed. Super speed is a bit of a cliche, as it seems most superheroes have some level of super speed, though certainly few reach the heights of, say, the Flash. But surely, if super strength is a potentially lethal gift to have, there couldn't be anything wrong with being super fast, could there? Well, at first glance, it would be pretty awesome to basically never have to use a car ever again. No more car payments or gasoline. You could be truly green for the environment. And of course, we all know the auto insurance industry is a complete scam on the consumer. But just how great would it really be to have super speed? First, there's the most obvious problem with super speed, and that's your brain. Your brain is pretty elastic, and with years of training, you can increase the speed of its reflexes to the point that you could, say, handle a Formula One racing car with incredible agility. but that takes years of training to achieve. And even then, Formula One race car drivers have an incredibly risky job and are always just one small mistake away from death. But they only have to race a few times a year. You would likely be tempted to use your super speed all the time. The faster you go, the less time your brain has to react to any changes in the environment, including upcoming obstacles. Push the limits of that super speed even higher, say to a few hundred miles per hour, and you basically would become completely unable to react to any change in your environment. You better hope you're on a straightaway in the middle of the desert without so much of a single ditch to stumble on, or you're going to be toast. Being super fast is fine and dandy, but your brain simply wouldn't be able to process sensory input fast enough to keep you from killing yourself. And that's the other downside to super speed. Because even at just 60 miles per hour, a slight stumble is going to end up with you tumbling out of control and turning all your bones into dust. Accidentally, even just brush by something else, and you'll be shattering the bones in your arm or hand. Then there's the stress super speed would put on your body, which is definitely not designed to go super fast. You better carry goggles with you everywhere you go, or you're going to end up getting all kinds of debris super stuck in your eyes, potentially causing serious damage if at fast enough speeds. Then there's the wear and tear to your muscles and ligaments, which will begin to form rips from being exerted at speeds far above what they were biologically designed for. Even if your body is somehow adjusted to super speeds though, all that rapid muscle movement is going to generate incredible amounts of heat. And since you don't come with a built-in radiator, you can expect to reach temperatures well in excess of 107 degrees Fahrenheit, which is when brain damage begins to occur. Then there's the simple biological need for energy. Go super fast and you're going to super burn calories, leaving you all but emaciated once you get to your destination. Push yourself too fast for too long and you might just drop dead from the sheer exhaustion. Your body's entire energy reserves completely drained. If somehow your body is able to store enough energy and not cook your brain, then you'd better have a very big wallet, because going super fast all the time is going to require a lot of calories. Professional cyclists can eat up to 8,000 calories a day. You'll be looking at many times that number. So I guess what we're saying is you better have a very big budget for food if you're going to be super fast, or you'll soon be super broke and super starving. Telepathy. Super speed and super strength sound like a bit of a bummer after all that, and maybe you decide that you're okay having average speed and average strength. Beats accidentally crushing a friend to death or splattering yourself against a brick wall after all. Telepathy seems safe then, and who wouldn't want the ability to read other people's minds or communicate without speaking at all? There's literally a million applications, and you could certainly abuse the power to make a whole lot of money. Got a job interview? Just read the boss's mind and figure out exactly what she wants to hear. But who needs a job when you can just travel from casino to casino, beating every card dealer in the world by reading their mind and knowing the cards they hold? The world is your mental oyster. It's time to shuck it. But you should probably ask yourself one question before you start reading everyone's mind. Just how thick is your skin, really? It's an important question because as you go rooting around in everyone's mind around you, you're going to start hearing their innermost personal thoughts, the things that are most secret and personal to them, and which, when you're around, are very often going to involve you. Sure, it'd be amazing to be able to tell the hot guy or gal at the store is secretly into you, but could you handle the dozens upon dozens of people you come across every day that definitely aren't? Can you handle hearing their innermost thoughts about your most glaring flaws, in their opinion, and just how unattractive they find them? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder after all, and something that one person finds adorable about you, at least a dozen other people might be completely repulsed by. More than just laying your physical shortcomings bare, what about realizing what people think about you personally? We all have friends, and we all definitely have some negative qualities we've observed about our friends, yet generally keep to ourselves as we accept that no one is perfect. Think you've got the stomach to hear all the negative qualities your various friends find in you? Can you handle finding out what all your perceived shortcomings are? Maybe you've got a pretty thick skin after all. Well then you'd better be ready for some disappointment in the romance department, especially if you're in a long-term relationship. Even the most committed, loving couples will occasionally be attracted to other people. It's simple human nature, and while it may never lead past a mere observation, it's almost certain that everyone has at least fantasized a little bit about somebody else. Think you could handle finding out that your partner of years and years has been fantasizing about a friend of yours, or maybe a new coworker? What about if you're making love and discover a lingering thought briefly appearing in your partner of somebody else? You could always make the effort to never stray into other people's minds, but let's face it, you're going to end up doing it eventually. The temptation is just too great. Let's say, though, that you instead use your telepathy to simply communicate to others. Surely, that can't go wrong, could it? Well, first, you better have damn good control of just how loud you make yourself inside somebody else's head. Because when you get overexcited in normal conversation, you might raise in volume, but with telepathy, you'll be increasing in intensity. An overexcited quip or reaction to your friend could end up leaving them with a crippling migraine or bloody nose. Or let's say you're back in that haunted house with a bunch of friends and lose control when you get scared. Congratulations, your mental scream just lobotomized everybody in a 20-foot radius. But even if you somehow manage extremely careful control of your mental volume, there's bound to be the occasional slip-up when you communicate when not meaning to. After all, your entire life, your innermost thoughts have been completely private, but now you've suddenly got the ability to channel them directly to someone else. Slip up, and you might accidentally broadcast to the person across from you exactly how you really and very unflatteringly feel about them. Get confronted by someone and you might accidentally divulge a deeply held secret, blurting it out mentally simply because you thought about it inwardly. Maybe it's best that we don't have Avengers-like superpowers after all, because great power does indeed come with great responsibility. But in the real world, it also comes with a whole slew of potential pitfalls, from breaking every bone in your body, to breaking every bone in your friend's body, to having your ego crushed by the unflattering opinions of every stranger around you. So you're minding your own business one day in your science lab when suddenly you're bitten by a radioactive spider while being bombarded by gamma rays, just as you inherit several $1 billion worth of advanced robotic war suits. Congratulations, you and your newfound superpowers and super wealth officially qualify to join one of the most elite evil fighting groups in the universe, the Avengers. But pump your brakes for a second there, hotshot, because while being a superhero may seem like an easy win-win, there's actually a great deal of reasons you may want to turn that membership down and go back to living the life of an average Joe. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're going to walk you through why being an Avenger would suck. There's no I in team. First and foremost, you can forget about going solo. You're part of Earth's most elite group of Avengers, so you're gonna have to start acting like it. That means no more solo excursions. Got some past grudges to settle? Tough luck, because you're gonna have to run all your superheroing past the rest of the group. As part of an elite organization of superpower-wielding badasses, your life will be no different than an employee at a large, prestigious company. You now officially represent the team's brand everywhere you go, which means if you want to do anything on your own, you better get approval from the rest of the organization first. The Avengers are a scary thing for most people. On a good day, they're protecting the people of Earth, but on a bad day, the Hulk is out rampaging and smashing millions of dollars of houses and vehicles. This can make the public jittery about the presence of this superpowered group. And so as to not raise the public's ire, you can no longer engage in any behavior which is off-brand for the Avengers. That means a strict code of conduct and ethics both, which must be adhered to at all times. And absolutely no going off and doing anything remotely non-Avenger-ish, including settling old grudges. In fact, your new life is gonna mostly revolve around the team, including your free time. If you like taking off on the weekends for long walks in nature to blow steam off and clear your head, you'd better find a new hobby. You're not just an Avenger now, you're a huge target for a staggering number of superpowered baddies who all very much want to destroy you and your team, so you can't give them a single opportunity to do so. That means no splitting up, leaving yourself vulnerable to getting captured or killed, or putting the rest of the team in a bind should an emergency arise. In the movies, it might be all fine and well for the group to get all emo and split off on soul-searching excursions, but in real life, all that'd be doing is letting supervillains lay traps to capture each individual member when they're at their weakest, alone. The real Avengers would have to stick together constantly in order to avoid being overpowered and destroyed one by one, which brings us to the next reason why it would suck to be an Avenger. They're out to get you. If you want to be an Avenger, we hope you're ready to deal with the ever-constant threats against your life, because literally everybody is going to be out to get you all the time. The Avengers traipse around the world and sometimes other worlds, putting down evil threats day in and day out, and all that superheroing adds up to a whole lot of very pissed-off supervillains with huge grudges against them. These villains are going to be plotting their revenges as soon as they're defeated, and as we've seen in some of the movies, those revenges can be quite clever and devastating indeed. Imagine falling into a mastermind revenge plot every single week, because that's what your life is going to be like the moment you hit a critical mass of pissed off bad guys. Returning war veterans often deal with huge amounts of PTSD that can severely affect their personal lives. After living for a few months to a few years in a war zone, constantly on the alert, their nerves are frayed to the point that loud noises can send them into an immediate defensive or violent posture. That's not their fault. Their brains have simply been trained by experience to constantly expect the worst, and in their case, the worst is a hidden IED or insurgent in civilian clothing opening fire unexpectedly. The frayed nerves can make PTSD sufferers break down mentally when triggered, leaving them in a poor emotional state and sometimes making daily life all but impossible. And sometimes the symptoms never fade away. Now imagine engaging in the huge climactic battles the Avengers are called to literally all the time. Your life is in danger constantly from superpowered threats, and you're routinely engaging in massive displays of violence. All that mental stress is going to add up to some serious PTSD. But especially when you consider that then in your day-to-day life, you have to be afraid of being ambushed by previous supervillains. You're living your life constantly looking over your shoulders, afraid of any situation that begins to seem even slightly out of the ordinary, and asking yourself if every new person you meet can really be trusted, or if they're just a pawn in some supervillain's plan to destroy you and your friends. Still sound like fun being an Avenger? Of course, you could just kill all of your foes and thus ensure that there's no one left to seek revenge. But that brings us to our next point on why being an Avenger is terrible. Paparazzi, all the time, everywhere. You're an Avenger. You're the ultimate public persona, champion of Earth, and superhero dedicated to protecting the weak. You're also under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable. Like we mentioned before, you're a good guy with superpowers, and that makes people feel safe. But it also scares them, because the greater your powers, the greater risk you are if one day you decide to stop being such a good guy. The more superpowered deeds you conduct, the more fear will grow of what would happen if you ever turned against the unsuperpowered public. To keep public paranoia in check, it's going to be important that you abide by the strictest code of ethics imaginable. You're going to be less superhero and more super altar boy, because you can't afford a single lapse in morality or judgment. So when you're up against your bad guy and ready to defeat him, sure, it would be easier to just smite him into next Tuesday and be done with it forever. But remember, people are going to be watching what you do very carefully. If you start offing supervillains left and right, it might be a pretty prudent and permanent solution to evil doing, but it's also going to start ringing some serious alarm bells with the public. And if the public gets scared, eventually that's going to bring the government into the picture. And you may have superpowers, but the government has super billions of dollars to research and develop ways to defeat and contain you. Get the public paranoid enough, and you just might find yourself locked up in a superpower-proof cage deep in a government detention facility somewhere. But it's about more than just exercising proper use of force in the middle of a fight, even if that means taking a serious ass-kicking on occasion, just so you don't appear like a mass murderer. It's also about your day-to-day behavior. You're a public symbol now, and you have to appear incorruptible, not just because everyone looks up to you, but because, again, if you don't play the Boy Scout good enough, the government is definitely going to be coming after you. That means giving up all your vices, because public scrutiny is going to dig into every inch of your life. Got an embarrassing internet search history? You better find a way to permanently delete it before the millions of hackers who all want to know what the latest superhero is into start hacking into your computer. Starting a new relationship? You better make sure that you have an ironclad non-disclosure contract in place before a spurned lover spills the beans about what you're actually like one-on-one and that weird stuff you like to do in bed. Enjoy occasionally smoking a cigarette? Forget about it. You're an icon for billions of children around the world now and can't set a bad example anymore. You better be ready for legions of fans and paparazzi to follow your every move. And if you think movie stars have it bad, imagine how much worse the saviors of the planet Earth would have it. Say goodbye to your privacy. Of course, threat of constant death and no more private life are pretty terrible, but neither can compare with the mental stress of actually having superpowers in the first place. Can't save everybody. We've all seen the commercials. For just 32 cents a day, you could ensure that a starving child somewhere has 3 meals a day. For 32 cents, you can end the daily misery of an innocent child, relieve the stress and pain of a poor parent doing everything they can to keep their child fed and healthy. You'll probably even save that child's life. Starvation is a leading cause of death amongst children in developing nations. What is 32 cents a day to you in your daily life anyways? That's barely $10 a month, and you can really make a difference for less than the price of one fast food meal. You right now have the superpower to ensure one starving child can be saved from starvation, yet most people choose not to do that. If you had real superpowers though, you would gradually become aware of the fact that every day millions of people suffer or die, and all it would take to stop it is one person with superpowers to help them. As you foil evil plot after evil plot, you won't be able to help but grow ever more aware of just how much misery you could personally end with the most minuscule of efforts. Stopping a rapist preying on a young child doesn't take nearly the same effort as toppling Thanos, and yet women and children are raped in staggering numbers every single day. Innocent people are murdered every day. The strong prey on the weak. Gangs push in on neighborhoods and terrorize local families. Natural disasters strike. The list goes on, and you could stop any of these things from happening. You could save dozens, hundreds, no, thousands of lives with the least effort. That mental stress is going to be significant, and as time goes on, it'll only build greater and greater. Maybe you do your best though and put in an honest 12 hours a day fighting crime and saving lives. What about when you want to take a day off? Taking a single day off is going to require you to mentally accept the fact that you are choosing to sit on the couch and play video games while people you could save are dying or being hurt. Try going to a movie and relaxing when you know that in the 2 hours you sat in that theater, hundreds of people you could have helped suffered needlessly. What we're saying is that you better have a good shrink, because at first it might seem fine to just blow off the mental stress, but as time goes on, the knowledge of how much evil you could stop is going to grow heavy indeed. Consider Superman. With his super senses, he can literally hear evil being committed, even when he's trying to blow off steam after a hard week of crime fighting by going on a casual date. Good luck enjoying literally anything ever again. If you think your current boss is bad, at least he doesn't possess absolute power over everything and anything. If you can't stand the way he micromanages you because you didn't stock the shelves properly or because you missed the memo about not wearing socks with sandals into work, consider yourself lucky. At least you have the freedom to complain to HR or quit your job if necessary. You have it easy when considering that if you lived during the medieval era and worked under a king, life would be much more stressful. Imagine for a moment working under the ultimate boss, a man who could potentially have you executed with a snap of his fingers if you messed up. Forget morale boosters. We'd bet you'd be plenty motivated to work hard under those frightening circumstances. During medieval times, the king was the most important figure, the highest-ranking member of the food chain. He exercised total power over his kingdom. As far as the people were concerned, his word was the word of God. Any rebellious acts of retaliation could result in death. To work directly under the king, say as a personal attendant, was considered a highly distinguished and honorable position. This was a higher level of position only granted to men of rank or sons of the king's closest relatives. Servants of the king were thought to be privileged, and if you happened to have the king's ear, you possessed more power that would make others flock to you as a leader. At court, it was best to be on the good side of those with the greatest influence. But with that power came great risks. If you ever slipped up and displeased the king, or if the people decided to create a false allegation against you out of envy for your position, you could easily find yourself in a great deal of trouble. Lose the trust of the king, and you were done for. Working for a king in this time meant treading on eggshells. Sure, you were highly esteemed by others, but you had to maintain a very strict poker face. To even think or imagine the king's death was treasonous, and there would be no way to prove yourself innocent if someone decided to accuse you of this based on a fleeting thought your facial expression betrayed. At that point, it would be up to your king to decide your verdict. Therefore, developing a close relationship with the king was vital for your survival. As long as you remained in his good graces, you were fine. For certain positions, earning and maintaining the king's trust was more essential than others. The more personal the position, the more you had to be on your guard. Working as a chamberlain, for instance, meant being responsible for the king's private quarters. To be the master of the wardrobe meant dressing the king and being responsible for his apparel. These positions led the worker to have more interpersonal interactions with the king, which meant having to be on your best game. So what's the closest you could get to the king to earn the most trust? We should add discretion about a very close interpersonal job with arguably one of the highest amounts of importance. This particular position required a lot of trust. Warning, it's really gross. It had to do with attending to the king in the bathroom. In these days, the king's health was closely monitored and constantly looked after by royal physicians. Poop was no exception. His stool had to be consistently checked. The attendant responsible for this not only had to wipe the king's behind after he was finished doing his business, but he also had to look at what came out to ensure that all appeared normal and, well, gross. Yes, it's disgusting to think about, but at the same time, this guy was most likely to have the king's ear due to the intimacy of the bathroom chit-chat. After all, as the king, you need to have a good relationship to allow a guy to put his hand on your backside. Not the most pleasant way to gain fondness, but hey, you have to do what you have to do to get ahead, right? Other more fragile positions of great importance that weren't as close required looking after the children of the king. We've spoken before about the vitality of kings to produce as many male heirs as possible to inherit the throne. Life was not always guaranteed, and a king needed plenty of sons for backup. If you worked as a nanny or an official protector for a young prince and, God forbid, something happened to the boy, let's say he caught the plague or sweating sickness, you could find yourself being blamed for his death. After all, he was under your care. He was your responsibility. A matter as grave as this could certainly lead to your undoing. The physician responsible for the medical side of things could also find himself under scrutiny. Servants who were responsible for hunting animals and those tasked with cooking and preparing meals, huntsmen and scullions, also had a pivotal role to play. Food had to be of great quality, meats had to be literally fit for a king and prepared regularly to feed the royal occupants of the castle. Taste testers had the job of putting their lives on the line by taking the first bite to make sure the food was not poisoned before being served to His Royal Highness. If the food was poisoned and harmed a taste tester, investigations would focus on those who were tasked with making it. So even if you did not intentionally poison the food, or if someone else did it, you could still find yourself in a very vulnerable situation. How could you even hope to prove that it was not you? Since there's no way for others to be sure that you are not lying, it's probably safer to just get rid of you and your coworkers and replace your staff entirely with new royal chefs. You know, just to weed out the culprit. But in this case, it's not just your career you should be worried about. After all, if you are suspect of plotting the king's death, you must have thought about it at some point before attempting it, which, as we discussed, was a crime in itself. Other important serving positions to the king included those related to military. Knights, squires, guards, gatekeepers, and other men-at-arms were tasked with protecting the king from threats, foreign or domestic. Many guarded the castle which contained the king. If necessary, they would have given their lives to protect him. Any failure or act of cowardice to perform their duty in the midst of danger would result in dishonor and ostracization. It could be argued that death in defending the king was preferable to the consequences of living life after failing to protect him. As a military personnel, you were probably trained to not hesitate in the face of danger, but still, sometimes human nature might push weaker souls to chicken out. Up until now, we've discussed predominantly male servant positions. This is because men were the ones who held the majority of jobs. Women were considered the more fragile sex. Their job in life was to keep their heads down, be humble, not to speak unless spoken to, obey their husbands, and produce children. But what about female servant positions, ladies in waiting and attendants? Well, they worked mainly under the queen. To be the queen was the highest rank a woman could ever hope to achieve, and to work directly under her as her personal servant was a position of great privilege. Like servants to the king, however, this job also came with certain risks. It was important to remain close to the queen and earn her trust, but similarly, if you displeased her, she could rat you out to her husband, who could simply have you removed. Sometimes, though, maintaining a close relationship with the queen could be very challenging, particularly if you were an attractive girl who happened to capture the king's special attention. Often, a king's beloved mistress had his ear and could be revered as a person in a position. If you were called to spend the night in the king's chamber, you couldn't say no. Yet, to do so could be detrimental to your relationship with your boss, the queen, creating an awkward, tense situation on the job when you were confronted with taking care of her needs. However, if you had to choose between remaining in good graces with the queen versus the king was probably your best option because as the man, he held more power. This is where strategy would come to play, so think of your game plan. Worst case scenario, if you were hated by the queen but loved by the king as his mistress, you would survive. If the opposite were true, the king's word was greater than the queen's, so your well-being would be more in jeopardy. If you found yourself in this situation, you would need to maintain the king's interest once you had it, otherwise you'd be left in a very fragile and precarious position. If you think about it though, maintaining the king's romantic attentiveness was easier said than done. While having any woman he wanted at his disposal, he could easily move on to someone prettier than you who could replace you as his mistress in an instant. Your position was not a stable one, especially if he had a wandering eye. This is why the Lady Anne Boleyn in the 16th century played an excellent hand when she would deny King Henry VIII's advances in order to maintain his interest long enough to become his queen. Though it didn't work out well for her in the end, she had been a worthy contestant in the risky game of royal love. Still though, she had been brave enough to stir the pot by telling the king no. It was unheard of for a woman to do so. Anne was considered lucky that in this instance of time, her actions sparked his affection rather than fueled his anger. She'd also sacrificed her relationship with Queen Catherine of Aragon as her lady-in-waiting in order to go after the bigger prize.
We realize this example comes from toward the end of the Middle Ages, but we'd say it still applies as the king possessed absolute power over Tudor England. Another complication with being an attendant to the queen had to do with the strength of the king's relationship with her. If the queen had a bad habit of committing adultery and cheated on her husband, you'd be torn between two options. Either you maintain her trust by keeping this a secret and hope she doesn't get caught, or you rat her out and face the consequences of your betrayal if she's found innocent. If, however, the queen was caught in the act and you did not report her wrongdoing, you'd be guilty by association. As you can probably tell, working for the king or queen came with great honor, but also required strategic critical thinking skills to stay on top. Like a game of chess, you had to be able to predict the next move and determine your actions based on the political game that came with being in a high-ranking servant position. Also, we should mention that there was also a risk if you were too close to the king and a rebellion overthrew him, because then you'd be considered an enemy of the people. Thus, it was wise to remain informed and alert at all times. The way you were perceived by others was also important. Sounds like enough to make your head spin, yet knowledge of the system was key to survival.
You're digging through your local library's archives trying to find out if your cousin was right and your great-great-great-uncle really was a Duke of the Lost Kingdom of Namek, where you stumble across a dusty box full of old letters. You start to read and find that it's a series of correspondences between two brothers from the year 1861, describing what life was like during the Civil War. Who cares about great-uncle whoever? This is way more interesting. What follows is a recreation of what this conversation might have been like. Dear Brother South, as I write this letter, the war wages on. I don't know how we got to this point. Brother against brother, father against son. In our last correspondence, we decided to keep each other updated on the daily happenings in our part of the country. Here in the north, times are hard, but we are surviving. The Civil War has torn this nation into two, and I feel as if you are in an entirely different country down there in the south. I just hope that the war ends soon, so that life can go back to normal, and we can see each other again. As I'm sure you remember, this Civil War started when South Carolina seceded from the Union last December in 1860. Then, a year later in April 1861, Virginia followed South Carolina and seceded from the North. This was caused by the firing on Fort Sumter and President Lincoln calling for 75,000 troops to take back the fort and disband the South Carolina militia. I don't have to remind you what happened next, as we're both living through the consequences right now. Up here in the North, this war has divided the community. I'm sure it's the same in your part of the country. People have to choose a side based on their beliefs. Not everyone agrees on the issues of war. Just yesterday, I got in an argument with my neighbor about the actions of the South. He claimed they had a right to secede from the ways of the North, and I disagreed. We got into an argument and punches were thrown. Sadly, this is not all that uncommon in this day and age. Regardless of where you live, differences of opinion always creep up and seem to lead to fisticuffs more often than not. On the other side of my farm is a family who considers themselves pacifists. They state their religious beliefs forbid them from taking sides, but instead dictate they should be kind to one another and allow for God to judge what is just. I find myself turning to religion more and more during this time. The church congregation grows as we all look for answers on how to end this civil war and return the country to some sort of normalcy. Please write back soon with updates about how you and your family are managing in these trying times. I eagerly await to hear about life in the South. Dear Brother North, I appreciated your letter and updates from your life in the upper states. Things here are similar to how you described them in the North. Communities are torn, and not everyone agrees with the secession in this part of the country. But our way of life was threatened. Many families support the government in the South because they do not want their way of life changed. Battles spontaneously breaking out between the armies is common down here in the South, as I am sure happens up in the North on occasion. It seems that we need to be ready for anything at all times. I've not joined the Confederate Army due to my old age and injured leg, but it is very difficult to carry out daily business with skirmishes happening on our farmland, and we are far from the only ones whose homelands have become battlegrounds. My neighbors and people all across the country have to flee for their lives as the two armies clash in cities, villages, and farms. It's a dangerous time to be a civilian. As in the North, all of our resources are going to fund the war. The food we grow on the farm gets collected and shipped out to soldiers on the front line. The wool we shear gets made into uniforms and sent to our soldiers across the country. The government says we will get paid for our goods, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. The government seems to believe that we are not as important as the war. I wonder if you're running into the same struggles in the North. I'm eager to hear back from you with updates on how the rest of your family is coping. Please write soon. Dear Brother South, just as the citizens of the South are struggling, the same can be said of average citizens in the North. Our food and goods go directly to the war effort. Just as you said, the government claims they'll provide restitution, but we have yet to see a penny. I will say that industrial factories and large businesses concerned seem to be doing well, since they are larger entities and vital to the war effort. The government wants to keep them happy and continually producing supplies. One of my friends in town who owns a textile mill is working all the time and making good money too, though he complains to me that the price of commodities has gone sky high. I too can barely afford necessities such as food we don't grow on the farm or candle wax. The military may be stocked with supplies, but the average person can't afford basic goods anymore. Furthermore, as you discussed in your last letter, the Civil War is damaging property all around the country. It's not just the military's forts and assets that are being affected, but the average citizen's homes and places of business. Just the other day, our granary was destroyed by a rogue cannonball from the battle across the river, and as the army retreats, they destroy any valuable assets or buildings that might be beneficial for the other side. This includes mills and factories, as well as food storage facilities. We're starving, and the army is destroying extra food stores to prevent the opposing forces from having access to them. Just give the food to the average citizen. This is lunacy. Not only are we suffering from battles and destruction of property, but both northern and southern governments are taking our horses and cattle. The horses are used for the cavalry and by officers. The cattle are used to haul heavy cannons and equipment. But where does that leave us? We no longer have any draft animals, which makes farming and traveling so much harder. I can only imagine how things are in the South. From what I hear, there are more battles being fought down there. That must mean more loss of property. Please let me know how your wife and daughters are faring. Stay safe. Dear Brother North, the average citizen is most definitely being harmed by the property loss and damages here in the South. We understand there is a war going on, but the disregard for people's property and lives by the government and the armies is appalling. All my sons have been enlisted in the army, and my wife and daughters have now taken care over all the responsibilities of the household and the workplace. My wife manages the farm, handling the business transactions and distribution of our crops to buyers. My daughters are out in the field every day harvesting crops and performing the labor that was normally reserved for my sons. The female citizens during this time have much more responsibility. It's disconcerting to me that they have no right to vote, even though they are helping keep our way of life together. I know that in the North this is also the case. After all over the average citizen's life will have to change. Everyone should have the right to vote, regardless of gender. Hopefully someday we'll get there. It is extremely common for average citizens to be uprooted and have to relocate because of battles occurring on their land. Just the other day, our neighbors had to pack everything they could carry into a wagon and move out west to try and start over. This isn't the first family I've known to do this, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Every time there's a battle, it's the average citizen who loses their land and the house. We are still able to farm and survive on our land, but who knows how long that will last. Without the females in the family, there would be no way to carry on. They've taken over almost every responsibility outside of fighting in the army. Life is extremely difficult right now in the South, and I know that in the North things are starting to look more promising. I look forward to your next letter. Hopefully you have some good news. Dear Brother South, it's happened. I know you wanted good news, but it's in short supply during the Civil War. Like so many other families, we've lost a family member to the war. One of my sons was fighting in the South and was killed in a battle. It is terrible news for anyone to receive, but it is all too common these days. Every family has been touched negatively by the war in some way. We've lost a son, others have lost fathers, brothers, or husbands. Loss is all too common. I've heard that 1 in 5 men who fought for the South have died in battle. I pray for your family every night before bed in hopes you do not lose anyone. But I know the reality of living during this time is that we'll all likely lose someone we care about. Here in the North, we're trying to stay busy at nights to keep our minds off the war. We tell stories about past adventures and tales of the Wild West. Sometimes we don't have wood for the fireplace, so we have to burn anything we can find. We have already lost a table and some chairs to the fire that keeps us warm at night. The winters have been brutal, so we have to find ways to keep the house heated. I've taken out my old banjo to play and sing songs to the family. It helps keep our minds off the hardships during the Civil War. I just hope that things get better soon. I really would hate to have to throw my instrument into the fire as kindling. I hope the weather in the south is warmer. Give my love to the family. Dear brother North, we are all grief-stricken over the loss of your son. I know words are meaningless in times like these, but I am sorry. The nights are still warm in the south, but we will have frost soon. I too have taken to music again, playing the fiddle and singing along with the family to keep busy. We also pick up a newspaper whenever a new issue is printed. It's a way to find out what's happening across this divided country, and sometimes there are stories of things outside the war, which is nice. It's amazing how the use of pictures and newspapers has changed everything. The newspaper reports on the events of a battle and the pictures allow us to see the images from the battlefield. It is frightening to think that in one of those photographs I might see someone I know. This civil war is a terrible time. It's a dangerous time to be a soldier and a tumultuous time to be an average citizen. We never know what will happen from day to day. Resources are going to the war effort with no remuneration paid to the average citizens who are providing them. Battles can destroy your entire home at any time. Necessities are too expensive for the average person to buy. It seems it's difficult to get by in the South and in the North. Sometimes during the war, the average person gets forgotten and left behind. Stay safe, and I'll see you on the other side. We hope that this reenactment gave you a unique perspective into the life of an average citizen during the Civil War. Here at the Infographic Show, we know that life during tumultuous times can be unsure and a bit scary. That's why it's important to understand past events and perspectives to learn and be better prepared for the future. I am going to be busy all day. And I know that because I just met with my Oval Office secretary who's filled me in about the long day ahead. I then have the Director of National Intelligence drop off my daily brief, which on this particular day is packed full of top secrets. No surprise there. I have the sudden urge to pee, so I head to the bathroom. Hey, we're all human here in the White House. After I've relieved myself, my ex-wife is on the phone berating me for something I'd done a decade ago. And then the White House executive chef calls me to tell me that the veal shanks are off the menu for dinner because he didn't like the look of the cuts. How can it be that the president can't get the best veal? But I've got a looming natural disaster in Pittsburgh and a bunch of tech geeks and an Asian prime minister to meet in the afternoon. Meanwhile, helicopters are flying over the White House as a precaution for a security threat that's been hanging around a little too long. Welcome to my kind of life. As you'll see, it's pretty hectic being what some people still call the leader of the free world. The reason for the helicopters is because I have a lot of things going on today and have to move around. I barely have time to eat the sausages that I have the chef fry up for me when I'm told it's time to go. I notice some flowers in the office are drooping, and so on my way out, tell the White House maid to make sure to water them. I'd sooner just hop on the helicopter from the South Lawn, but my advisors tell me it's a good time to be seen traveling around in the presidential car. That security threat isn't high, but still, the motorcade, I'm told, has been bolstered today. That's the thing most of you don't realize. It's hard on a man knowing that there are lots of people that want him dead, inside his own country and outside. Sure, you have your known enemies, but when you're head of the country, it's not like someone's going to tell you they're going to kill you. It just doesn't happen that way. My enemies are everywhere, and every day I pray it won't be my last. It's not like in the real world where you know who your enemies are. You don't get to fight or argue. If they get you, it comes out of nowhere, and that's a constant stress on me and my family. You should see my blood pressure. I was a regular 140/90 man before I took this job, and now I'm lucky if I get a 170/100. You know what that's called? Hypertension. My personal physician says I'm in the high range of hypertension. You know what that can lead to? Heart failure, stroke, dementia, the loss of eyesight. And I can tell you, this job would not be easy for a blind man. As for dementia, well, it seemed to work for some in the past. And that's a joke, by the way. Presidents can joke, guys. We get in the car and the motorcade takes off. It's funny, I know I'm safe and all, but I always look through the back windows to see if we're being tailed. I've got a rally to attend at a university. Intelligence reports state that I should have a lot of support there, but after reading my social media feeds lately, I don't need intelligence to inform me I have a lot of haters there too. You know what some journalist had the audacity to call me yesterday? His exact words were, a warmongering corporate shill dressed in sheep's clothing. I'm not going to get into it with you, but I can tell you that I have a job to do and you just can't win at times. It doesn't matter what you do, the insults just keep flooding in. It's almost as bad as the YouTube comments section. What that guy wrote was opinion dressed as journalism. Opinionism. That's what most of them do these days. You can win all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you can't win all the people all the time. You heard that first here from your dear Mr. President. I'm not a warmonger, and I've been applauded for my work on foreign policy. I'm certainly not a corporate shill. It just looks that way at times. Okay, not everything trickles down, but a drop is better than a drought. Sometimes I know for sure I've created a policy that's for the greater good of the country, but you know what? Even if it's successful, the media will just look for the next problem. Bad news sells. If it bleeds, it leads. And the public wants blood on the front page, often my blood. In the few months I've been in power, I've already implemented some social policies to benefit the underdogs, and that's been mostly ignored by the press. But you know what? The president is always an underdog. Like I said, we can't win. It's like this. The job means you're a target. You sell newspapers, and each day you get Lilliputian spears fired at you from one side for your failures, while the other side is busy mending yesterday's wounds. This never stops. And I'm a moving target, a fairground attraction, a fish in a great big barrel that's called the USA. You know what my job feels like? It feels like being inside one of those whack-a-mole machines, and it's my head they're whacking. My ex-wife is on the phone again? You do remember it's your first child's birthday in a week? She says snarkily. How could I forget? I tell her. But I won't be able to make the party. I tell her I'll send some guys around with a gift. She hangs up without responding. Not a second later, my present wife, the first lady, calls me. Did I take my beta blockers this morning? She asks. I tell her I indeed did. She's looking after my heart, and I'm trying to look after a nation. I couldn't do it without her support, to be honest. She tells me to watch my weight while I'm reading a document about an exonerated man from death row. The whole world is criticizing our justice system, and I'm the man that should fix it. Talk about juggling crises. She keeps on talking as I'm watching the people stare at the motorcade passing by. Someone waves, another person shows me the middle finger, and that's the presidency in a nutshell. My wife wants to change the color scheme in the White House bedroom. And why did she find alprazolam hidden in the bathroom cabinet? Am I stressed? Of course I'm stressed. Look at me. I'm 8 months into the job and already my face is shriveling up like that red woman in Game of Thrones when she takes off her necklace. I'm aging faster than any other human being. I'm on dog years right now. What's that? 4 years in the White House means you serve 28 years? I'll probably leave that place on a walking frame looking like my wife's great uncle. I just got word that the rally's been canceled. That's a relief. Students can be touchy. I prefer the old folks. Their blood doesn't run so hot. Okay, turn around. We're going back. Now I've got time for a bite to eat, but I have to answer about 50 phone calls as I'm trying to get down a corned beef and pastrami sandwich. 49 of those calls each take a minute off my life. That's what a phone call is for me, a kind of cigarette health hazard. The only non-stressful call, the roofing is finally finished on my holiday home. I've got those smarmy tech executives coming in about 43 minutes to talk about automation and security. I'm not exactly as well versed in tech as those Silicon Valley guys, but I've got minutes to read the details of the meeting, and I'm going to get a short brief beforehand from one of my advisors. And that's another thing, we just don't talk about war and wages and environmental matters. We have to know a lot about everything. Sure, I'm surrounded by able men and women, but if I make one comment that makes me sound uneducated or naive, I'll be ripped to pieces in the media. The tech guys are friendly enough, but billions in the bank, to be honest, has made them a little too overconfident for my liking. Talking with them, you sometimes get the feeling that they think they are in charge. My $400,000 a year probably seems like chump change to them, but I could soon make a dent in their fortunes. Fully autonomous flying vehicles hovering over the streets of the USA in 2035, I'm told. There are no bad actors exploiting our systems, they say. Yeah, right. And I've got aliens hiding in the closet. The press is allowed in at the end of the meeting, and we tell them only a few of the things we've actually said. The meeting was successful, that's all they need to know. Headline in tomorrow's newspaper, White House gives green light for self-driving flying vehicle testing. God, the media is so predictable. I could write tomorrow's headlines myself. Then again, I am the president. After meeting is lunchtime, spaghetti and meatballs and tiramisu for dessert. The tomato sauce isn't right again, and I tell my chief of staff to have a quiet word with the chef. I should fire the guy. Can I fire the guy? I wonder if I should fire the guy. The veal, the sauce. I've got more important things to think about. My ex-wife calls again. What is it this time? I ask. I'm really busy today. You do know that I'm the president now. Can she have a security detail to take the kids to McDonald's? Do you know how much that costs? I tell her. It can't be done. But my advisor tells me she should use the drive-thru. She hangs up again. Next are the handshakes. Yep, that's all I'll call it, the handshakes. That's all it is. Sometimes it makes me feel like a performing monkey. Here's my hand, shake it. See, I'm just like you. People who I don't know come to the White House and I smile like a Cheshire cat and thank them for whatever they've done. It doesn't matter what kind of mood I'm in, I have to look like a man without a care in the world. A serious man, of course, but a man who holds the weight of the world in his hands like a professional basketball player spins a ball on his finger. Presidents are not allowed to show overt happiness. We don't get giddy, we can't show sorrow or sadness unless the sorrow or sadness is a political thing. We are unable to openly express our feelings about our relationships, we don't discuss our inner doubts, our reservations about what we do, we cannot ponder the futility of our existence, our words are scripted or at least self-censored, we have to be almost robotic, act like an automaton, and yet at the same time we have to be more than human. We are men pretending to be superhuman. And this, my friends, is not always easy. You know why? I do get depressed, I do have doubts, I have remorse, and I sometimes cry, like a baby, alone, where no one can see me. I have days I ate the wrong food, and during a speech I feel as though I'm gonna drop a load in my pants on live TV in front of millions of viewers. I'm normal. But the president doesn't run off to the bathroom and let loose a waste supernova. I've even had to hold in my farts. Presidents apparently are above letting one go. I know you won't pity me, but trying to be abnormal all day is tiresome. We live two lives, and seldom can those two lives integrate. A fine example of this fact is I've just had a raging argument with my wife. She wants to spice up the bedroom with raunchy vermilion drapes and wine-colored wall paint. I just don't understand this at all. Red hues are just not presidential. Sure, I probably need to liven things up in the bedroom, but since I've taken this job, I've kind of lost interest. I tell her we'll stick with the antique silver drapes and cosmic latte beige painted walls for now. No, she demands. You might be the leader of the most powerful nation on earth, but that doesn't give you the right to think you're an interior designer. I've said what I have to say, I tell her. This house is a democracy and right now it's a 1-1 stalemate, so things will just have to stay the way they are. This is how things work in this country. Shaking her head in disgust, she picks up the book I'm reading, How to Win Friends and Influence People. She looks me right in the eye and says, "And you say you're a progressive man of real change. I've seen more progression in a two-footed tortoise," she shouts. "You're an idiot and a selfish husband too." I've got to go, I tell her. As soon as I open that bedroom door, I know she has to be quiet and smile, because a president and his first lady can never be seen not getting along. So imagine just being in that heated domestic situation and then segueing into what happened next. I've just been informed that the leader of Quasiland is here and it's time to entertain him for a bit. We shake hands first and a few photos are taken before we get down to business, and I tell him I'll take him for a tour around the White House gardens. His broken English is a bit hard to understand, but the man at least tries. This is a show more than anything else. I've been briefed, of course, about what's going down in Quasiland and that the world democracy is kind of flexible there, but the good news is the PM is looking to buy some very expensive fighter jets, and this is how it goes. You talk about the humanitarian stuff and then you get down to business. Diplomacy. It's my middle name. I wave goodbye to the PM and at last I can have some time to myself. Well, with the family. The kids are back from school, which is a relief because I won't have to talk about spicing up the bedroom. It's not easy bringing up the kids in the White House. It's not like they can just hang out with who they want. Their freedom is compromised as much as mine. Well, almost. It bugs them too. And that they're seen as the president's kids rather than have their own identity. The poor things have very few choices, which makes life difficult for them. "Can we have that chocolate mousse again, Daddy?" my first daughter asks. "No, darling," I say. "I've decided we're having apple pie for dessert tonight." They sit there wishing that they could just go out into the city and run around like normal people. They're well aware that somewhere Secret Service guys are waiting. They know that right now thousands if not millions of people are saying awful things about their father. The other day, one of my daughters came home crying because a kid at school had shown her a photo of me from my university days that had been circling around the internet. The photo shows me lying on the floor asleep, covered in my own vomit, with the word loser written on my forehead. I have to admit, for a moment I did wonder if it was okay to send a few guys around to that kid's house to make the 11-year-old sweat a bit. Still, guilty as charged. The past is in the past. We watch a bit of TV and that usually means Netflix. The news for me feels like watching work. So that's a no-no after 6 p.m. If the news should happen, I'll be the first to know. Around 11 p.m. I get into bed with my wife. I can tell she's still a bit upset about the color scheme thing, but she'll get over it. As usual, I'm waiting for that late-night call regarding some important matter or other, but it doesn't come. I grab my self-help book and start reading from one chapter. Whenever we're wrong, we should admit it immediately. When we fight, we never get enough, but by yielding, we often get more than we expected. I lean over and hug my wife. "Sorry about the argument today," I say. "Ouch!" she suddenly cries. "Have you clipped your toenails lately? Those things feel like talons." "I can't seem to find the clippers," I tell her. She turns off her bedside lamp and mutters in a tired voice, "Don't we have staff for that kind of thing?" It's been said that there's nothing more noble than humanity does than spaceflight. And it's us, we're the ones that said that just right now. Sure, humans do a lot of great things, but we do a ton of completely awful things too. The challenge of space travel, though, forces us to pool together the best of humanity, because space wants nothing more than to kill you in the most horrible ways possible. After visiting the moon, though, the rest of the world decided that sitting parked in low Earth orbit was good enough for humanity, and that doesn't mean that our most recent and greatest accomplishment in space, the International Space Station, isn't any less of a wonder. Weighing in at 925,335 pounds, or 419,725 kilograms for nations who didn't land on the moon, the ISS is 73 meters long and 109 meters wide. Aside from the Earth, the ISS is the single largest human-inhabited structure in our entire universe. In fact, it's the largest thing built by humans to ever exist outside of the planet. But as awesome an accomplishment as the ISS is, the simple fact is that life in space is tough. Turns out, humans are pretty badly adapted by evolution for living outside the Earth's protective atmosphere. Who knew? So if your dream is to become an astronaut, get ready to learn why life on the ISS absolutely sucks. Working out all the time. Humans evolved on Earth, but in the last 60 or so years, we decided that Earth wasn't good enough anymore, and just like the Jeffersons, we moved on up to a deluxe apartment in the sky. Sort of. Turns out, though, that trying to live somewhere you didn't evolve to habitate comes with some pretty serious side effects. On Earth, we have the gentle but constant pull of gravity keeping us firmly in place and occasionally reminding us that flying through the sky in giant metal tubes is blasphemy. All that gravity has a pretty profound effect on the evolution of our physiology, and very quickly after starting their respective space programs, both the USSR and United States discovered that fact. Gravity's incessant pull keeps our bones strong as our body constantly reinforces them with calcium so that we don't collapse into a heap whenever we try to stand up. It also has a myriad of unknown effects on the way that blood circulates and even how organs operate, and we're still learning about these effects as NASA prepares for long-term human habitation of the moon, and eventually Mars. If you don't like exercising, then space is not for you, because if you want to live in space, you're gonna have to do a whole lot of exercising. Each day, astronauts exercise for at least 2.5 hours using specialized equipment meant to help them combat the effect of zero gravity on their bodies. Without exercise, astronauts start losing both muscle and bone mass because the body has nothing to fight against. But it's not just becoming a smaller, shrimpier version of yourself that you have to worry about, because low gravity makes it harder for blood to get around in your body, making you at risk of extreme fatigue and passing out. Fatigue, loss of bone mass and muscles, and the threat of constantly fainting, the ISS definitely sounds like a place it sucks to live in. But if you have a sensitive nose, you won't like our next reason why living in the ISS sucks. Recycled farts. Take in a deep breath. Odds are you probably smell whatever's immediately around you. But even if that scent is bad, you know it's just not gonna linger for long. If your brother starts getting a bad case of the bottom-end grumps, you know all you have to do is open a window and the stink is nothing more than a memory. Now imagine that you can't open a window, or that you never get fresh air. That's the ISS. One of the chief concerns of spaceflight is ensuring that the astronauts have enough breathable oxygen. Because after extensive scientific research, man's greatest minds deduced that breathing is pretty important for keeping people alive. But getting things into space is extremely expensive, so expensive that getting a few months' worth of oxygen up to the ISS is simply a non-starter without bankrupting a small nation. That's why the ISS uses state-of-the-art oxygen recycling systems, which can reuse oxygen over and over again. It does this by first splitting the water brought up in resupply missions into oxygen and hydrogen. That hydrogen is recombined back into water using black magic, or science, we guess, which in turn means you can create more oxygen. But that also means that you're going to be rebreathing the same fart for a very long time. Like astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space and said in an interview once, smells linger on the ISS, especially because without gravity, scents can more freely spread. But bad smells isn't all, because aboard the ISS, everything, not just air, has to be recycled, and that means water, as in the water you pee out. As another astronaut put it, yesterday's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. You'll be drinking so much of your own pee in space that it'll make Bear Grylls proud. Showers can and will kill you. Who doesn't love a nice hot shower? Well, on the ISS, taking a shower is not just practically impossible, but also potentially deadly, as American astronauts found out back in the Skylab days. During the early days of spaceflight, when crews would be in space for a few days, they had no chance to clean themselves. and it was said that the smell of returning astronauts and cosmonauts was so strong that it was like running into a wall for the crews that recovered them. When the US put its first space station into orbit, Skylab, one of the things that NASA determined would be important was crew comfort, and so it included a sort of shower. The Skylab shower consisted of a special curtain you could pull up around you, which cocooned you into a small tube-like structure. Then you turned on the water, which shot down on you from above. Above, of course, being an extremely relative term in space. You would then lather up and wipe yourself clean with floating water before vacuuming it all up. The problem, though, is that in zero gravity, water behaves more like jello than, well, water, and tends to clump together. Also, it has nowhere to fall to, so it just sort of floats around, heading wherever it last had momentum toward. This proved to be particularly dangerous as large clumps of water could easily be inhaled or float directly over an astronaut's mouth or nose. Also, there was the ever-present threat of water getting loose and floating everywhere. And on a space station jam-packed with delicate electronic equipment, the last thing you want is an electrical short. Skylab's shower risks were so bad that when it came time for the ISS, NASA said astronauts would just have to resort to wiping down manually. While many astronauts will attest that you can get decently clean in space wiping yourself down with wet towels, the truth is that you can only get so clean when you can't run soap and water over you. Radiation everywhere. On Earth, radiation is only a concern when ordering sushi fished off the coast of Fukushima or when one's trying to get the superpowers of a spider. Space, however, is pretty much lousy with radiation, and at such extreme altitudes, astronauts on the ISS don't enjoy as many of the benefits of Earth's magnetic field to protect them as we do. You'll pretty much notice immediately that you're suddenly smack dab in the middle of a cosmic radioactive shooting gallery the first time you close your eyes. With your eyes closed, you'll start seeing flashes of light, like some sort of disco resurgence, but it's not terrible 70s music making a comeback, it's the universe trying to murder you to death. Stars, black holes, and all kinds of other celestial phenomena do all sorts of sciencey stuff all the time. A lot of that nerdy sciencey stuff creates radiation. That radiation then travels across the universe until it finds your soft, squishy body full of DNA to destroy. The awesome light show you're enjoying with your eyes closed is highly charged particles smacking into your eyeballs and tricking your brain into believing it's receiving a signal telling your eyes that they see light. And the flashes are just from the radiation hitting your eyes. Imagine how much more blasts the rest of your body and you can't even see. But of course, the ISS is well shielded against radiation, but nobody knows just how well protected you would be in the ISS from a particularly energetic release of radiation by the sun or a nearby star. Even with low levels of radiation, though, the fact is your DNA is still being cooked over weeks, months, or even years in space. What does all that radiation do to your body? Well, we haven't observed enough individuals for long enough who've endured long-term spaceflight to really know yet. Most scientists agree that astronauts have a higher chance for cancer, and maybe like a 0.01% chance of superpowers, but just how big a chance for the big C is unknown. What is for sure, though, is that if the ISS's shielding ever failed or was damaged somehow, and a strong blast of radiation washed over it, you'd be cooked faster than popcorn on high. Speaking of cooking, though, if going to space makes you hungry, enjoy your food while you still can here on Earth, because in space, the food is terrible. You can't really cook in space, at least not in the conventional sense. We're pretty sure most of our fans already knew that. Lugging up the supplies for making a home-cooked meal in space would be pretty wasteful use of very limited space on cargo flights. Plus, how would you even keep pancakes from just floating off a pan? Instead, all space food comes in plastic packaging. And while you might have an oven to heat it up, it's all pre-cooked. NASA does try to provide variety in order to keep morale up, but the simple fact is that pre-cooked meals taste universally terrible. And even more so when the actual food you serve up on the ISS has to be something that won't make a giant mess. Macaroni and spaghetti with meatballs is a staple item, but forget about a nice stew or a lentil soup. Condiments are available, though salt and pepper come in liquid form. And we have no idea what that even means, nor do we want to find out. The reasoning is solid though. Salt and pepper in their normal forms would simply float away and just get everywhere. It's a good thing that the condiments are available because you simply won't taste much of your food unless it's lathered in pounds of condiments. If you've ever seen footage of astronauts in the ISS, no doubt you've noticed they all look a bit puffy in the face. That's because without gravity, all the fluids in your head go on a free-for-all, floating around wherever they like. In turn, this makes astronauts congested, and if you've ever had a really bad cold, then you know that unless you're eating wasabi by the spoonful, you really can't taste much. Terrible food, radiation that'll kill you, recycled farts, and showers that'll drown you. Life on the ISS definitely sucks. which only makes us admire more the men and women who are even there right now pushing the limits of the final frontier. When one thinks of what the life of a sniper is like, it's a common misconception, probably as a result of modern-day films like American Sniper, that snipers in the field are always out there taking out bad guys and carrying out high-risk secret missions. While that's undoubtedly the case as part of their bigger job description, both historically and today the life of a sniper has varied widely due to both the country and conflict. In today's video, we'll look at how the life of a sniper has evolved from its humble beginnings to the professional marksmen they are today. Snipers in American military history first came about during the French and Indian War. However, if you called any of these skilled marksmen and backwoodsmen snipers, they'd probably look at you funny. That's because back then, through the Civil War, snipers were only known as sharpshooters. Sharpshooters during the war were usually men selected for not only their prowess with a rifle, but their ability to track and hunt down the enemy in rugged environments, operate independently for long periods of time, and report back vital information on enemy movements. For that reason, the first American sharpshooters were men who had a wide range of experiences operating in the backwoods. The first organized unit of sharpshooters, Rogers Rangers, organized by Major Robert Rogers, came about during the French and Indian War. Before this time, sharpshooting and tracking were seen more or less as a dirty, non-honorable way of warfare. British and other European commanders looked down upon these savage modes of fighting beneath the classic line-style fighting designed for European battlefields. However, in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, new methods of fighting had to be tried after several disastrous defeats of British regulars at the hands of the French and their Native American allies. Lucky for the British, they found their answer in Major Robert Rogers. As a boy, Rogers had witnessed the aftermath of a French-led Native American raid on a nearby town. After being forced to pull down the inhabitants' entrails and body parts that were strewn about in the trees, he made a promise that he would avenge these people and fight back just like them. After joining the British Army, his ideas were not met with much enthusiasm until 1757, when he was finally authorized to recruit a crack unit of sharpshooters to counterstrike at the enemy, since the war was not going well for the British. Rogers Rangers soon grew to 7 companies strong, and were made up of the most rugged backwoodsmen and marksmen that the new colonies could muster. These men were tasked with bringing the fight back to the enemy any way they could. They were ruthless in their fighting style, with one of Rogers' standing orders stating that after engaging the enemy with their rifles, they were to close with their hatchets to finish the job. They were also paid a £5 sterling bounty, almost $1,000 US today, for each French or Indian scalp they brought back from raids. Rogers Rangers were also expected to be on the move and travel lightly, save for a large quantity of powder and ammunition, since they were always expected to do a lot of shooting. The men operated mainly as a sort of what's today called quick reaction force. Whenever there was an attack, the Rangers were sent out to find, track, and ambush the enemy responsible. When they were not doing that, they would embark on their long-range patrols of scouting enemy positions and ambushing anyone they could find anywhere they found them. Throughout their existence, Rogers Rangers were involved in hundreds of skirmishes and battles throughout North American wilderness. Their prowess and capability cannot be underestimated, as their consistent harassing attacks and intelligence provided British commanders with the ability to maneuver their forces smartly to avoid being cut off and surrounded like they were earlier in the war. At the end of the French and Indian War, the American colonists formed their own crack unit of sharpshooters known as Morgan's Rifles during the American Revolution. This unit, led by Colonel Daniel Morgan, would become the eyes, ears, and surgical precision instrument of Washington's army. Recruited from the same stock of men as before, their role still included plenty of scouting and harassing of Native American settlements in retribution for raids earlier in the war. However, as the war progressed, the men became less and less of a long-range reconnaissance group and more of a tactical element to be employed on the battlefield. One of the first instances of this was their consistent harassing of General Howe's army as it retreated from New Jersey. Along their entire march, Morgan's Rifles used their superior Kentucky rifles to snipe at the Redcoats at distances of up to 500 yards, an unheard-of distance and tactic for the time. As the men fought with the British more often toward the end of the war in 1781, the men formed part of a corps infantry battalion that, under the leadership of Morgan himself, was crucial in defeating the British in the Battle of Cowpens. The battle forced Cornwallis to abandon his invasion of the South and seek refuge at Yorktown for rest and refitting. After that, well, you all know the story. After the American Revolution, it seems that the practice of employing sharpshooters fell largely out of favor until the advent of the American Civil War. It was here that sharpshooters would begin to become assets whereby their tactical decisions would have long-term operational and strategic impacts on the war itself. Shortly after the war broke out, sharpshooters began to take well-aimed shots at high-ranking officers and generals on both sides. The first general officer casualties to snipers happened during the first few months of the war, and the practice of sharpshooters aiming to take out generals would become standard practice throughout the war. However, the life of a sniper in the Civil War and who could become a sniper was radically different than before. Prior to this conflict, sharpshooters would have acquired the skills necessary to become a sniper years before joining the army. However, now, with the meat grinder of the war in full swing and no end in sight, the Union needed to pump out several regiments of sharpshooters for frontline service and did not have the luxury of waiting. Initial qualifications to become a sniper were, of course, the ability to be a good shot. Their own commanding officer also had to be recommended, as only mature, physically fit, and intelligent men could become a sharpshooter. Once passing a shooting test, those that made it were given a lot of on-the-job training by veterans who had already experienced the horrors of modern combat. One of the most significant changes that came about was how snipers would operate on the battlefield. Instead of scouting and harassing the enemy far behind their lines, the main job now was to support the infantry and exploit weak points in enemy positions. A perfect example of their life during this time comes during the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi. During the siege, the Confederates were holed up in a fortress of a city that had repelled with heavy casualties several Union assaults to take it. As a result, hundreds of sharpshooters were let loose about their deadly work to degrade Southern morale and take out any Confederate that dared move around. From the memoirs of a Confederate captain who survived the battle, the effects of the sharpshooters were astounding. They would shoot at anything and everything that moved. No matter the time of day or where they were, the men were always in a constant state of fear. Even looking over the parapets of the trenches for even a moment was a probable death sentence. The sniper shot so much that it literally was impossible to move during the day. Only at night could the men leave the comfort of their trenches, and even then it was still risky. While his men took serious casualties during several Union assaults, it was the consistent daily casualties from sniper fire that dwindled down his numbers and sapped the will to fight from the survivors. Such a strategic implementation of employing snipers have never been seen before on the American continent and would not be seen as a terror weapon again until World War II. Though World War I saw extensive use of snipers, especially with the advent of new technology such as telescopic sights, the use of spotters and decoys beyond these tools in their life did not differ much from that of an ordinary soldier due to the essentially static nature of the conflict. It was during World War II, however, that the life of a sniper changed dramatically due to the largest and most intense theater of war in human history, the Eastern Front. Snipers on the Eastern Front faced a genuinely unique experience. Due to the sheer scale of the German invasion and the need for practical tools to stem the enemy tide while the Red Army recuperated from its losses, snipers here saw arguably the most widespread use, and thus were the most successful snipers in the history of warfare. A perfect example of how many of the highest-scoring Soviet snipers got their feet wet in the field was none other than Vasily Zaitsev. Beginning the war as a clerk in the accounting department of the Navy in its Far Eastern Fleet, Vasily yearned for a chance to fight at the front. After his request to go into combat was approved, he was attached to the 284th Rifle Division and sent to the Battle of Stalingrad. It was here in the autumn and winter of 1942 that Vasily would learn how to become a sniper and change the course of history for the Soviets and future snipers altogether. In the rubble of the ruined city, he first began his forays on his own time after the unit had stopped fighting for the day. He would set out with his standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle and attack any targets of opportunity he could find. Officers, artillery observers, machine gunners, radio operators, and of course other snipers were the primary targets he would hunt. Unlike the famous Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä, Vasily wanted to effect a real change on the battlefield with just his rifle. As a result, though he would take shots at average German troops, he would always try to take out high-value targets first, so that the infantry would have an easier time on the ground. His tactics paid off, and within a matter of months he rose from relative obscurity to a national hero. Soviet leadership, sensing his value as a trainer for future generations of snipers, removed him from the front lines and had him teaching new crops of snipers to carry the fight to the enemy. After Vasily's successes became widely known, Soviet doctrine also began to change so that by the end of the war, the average infantry platoon was assigned at least 2 snipers for long-range fire support. However, life as a sniper in World War II varied greatly depending on the front and the combatant. While the Allies, such as the Soviet Union, the US, and Great Britain, all began embedding snipers as a direct infantry support weapon, countries like Nazi Germany began to use them as a terror tactic once more. While professional German snipers continued to operate through the end of the war in the same way as their enemy counterparts, larger and larger numbers of semi-professional and inexperienced snipers were employed to cause havoc beyond the front lines. It was quite common, especially on the Western Front, that when German forces retreated, they would leave dozens or sometimes hundreds of sacrificial snipers behind to cause as much damage as possible. These snipers oftentimes wreaked havoc on advancing Allied troops who thought they were safe from German gunfire, only to be cut down miles behind the front from concealed snipers in trees, bushes, buildings, and chimneys. Though often successful in striking their enemy, these snipers were less trained and less experienced than their counterparts who had been fighting for years already. Oftentimes, these were one-way suicide missions with massive retaliation in the form of artillery, plane, and tank attacks used to flush out these last-ditch defenders. After the end of World War II, snipers still retained this infantry support role. During the Korean War, they proved vital at striking at the unseen enemy in the mountains and valleys of the Korean Peninsula. In Vietnam, the American military began to employ them once again into what's morphed into the modern-day role as a scout sniper. The role of a scout sniper is twofold. Their primary job is to be inserted behind enemy lines to operate independently and report on enemy locations. Such actions were as vital then as today in fighting a guerrilla war where large bodies of troops can move unseen and are hence avoided by the enemy. Snipers operating in small teams can easily blend in with the environment and report back vital intelligence that can either be used to rain down indirect fire on an unsuspecting enemy or help plan coordinated search and destroy missions. Snipers today are fortunate to have years of modern developments in ballistics, scopes, and rifles at their fingertips. Because of this, snipers in an infantry support role can now consistently hit targets over a mile and even a mile and a half away. Because of this, snipers can provide valuable top cover to infantry operations where they can take out or at least suppress enemy movements to cover advancing troops. Who wouldn't want $1 billion? Honestly, you might not want $1 billion once you hear why being a billionaire actually sucks. First, and this should be the most obvious, wealth might not necessarily change you, but it definitely changes the people around you. In the survey of the ultra-rich conducted by Boston College, respondents claimed that their personal relationships were directly impacted by their wealth and how much of it they spread. As one person put it, I started to wonder how many people we know would cut us off if they didn't think they could get something from us. Co-workers, friends, even family members all become suspicious characters to a billionaire. How much of their affection and attention is the real thing? It's why people such as presidents adopt a no new friends rule after attaining higher office, like the mega wealthy, the mega famous, and mega visible are prime targets for opportunists from every corner. One financial firm even has psychiatrists on staff specifically to address wealthy clients' issues with family members. And don't get us started on the love lives of billionaires. In addition to the worry that your spouse might just be a gold digger, writer Paul Sullivan pointed out that the expense of a divorce suit, which gives most of us pause, is not a concern for the ultra-wealthy, making intimacy disposable. But don't take our word for it, let's look at J. Paul Getty, the petroleum industrialist worth over $6 billion when he passed away at age 83 in 1976. Getty was married 5 times in his lifetime. 4 of those marriages lasted less than 4 years, and all of them ended in divorce. Getty also had a rotating door of mistresses, but his failed marriages continued to haunt him. Despite the money, despite the ready access to willing lovers of all ages, Getty said, "A lasting relationship is only possible if you are a business failure. I would gladly give all my millions for just one lasting marital success." Getty's 5 marriages did result in 5 sons, but that brought another headache. And our second reason why you don't want to be a billionaire: you worry more about your kids. Some billionaires have said they worry their children will become too comfortable, too entitled, and may even resent not having more. Not just in terms of material wealth, but in terms of being automatically trusted to take on the family business. Ben Mesrich, the author of The Accidental Billionaires and a slew of other books on millennial wealth, said the children of the supremely wealthy often have lots of issues because they've never had to struggle, and struggle makes us strong. And if you don't have to struggle, you just drift along. Or as Michael O'Church also put it, the children of the wealthy tend to live in an uncanny valley. Enough ambition to know they should be making something of themselves, but not enough discipline to actually do it. In a BBC article from 2015, one alleged son of a billionaire wrote that many relatives of the patriarch, not seeing the work that goes into starting, building, and maintaining the wealth, expect to live lavishly now without having to earn any of the benefits the chief breadwinner works for. Now imagine you are the billionaire. You know the struggle to make money, you know how to maintain it. But since you can't take it with you, wouldn't you want your kids to have those same skills? To see money as not given, but something to be valued? That's something the Getty family dealt with a lot. With 5 sons and 14 grandchildren, most of whom Getty was estranged from, there was bound to be some trouble. One of his sons was Eugene Paul Getty, who adopted the name John Paul Getty Jr. when he reconciled with his father after 12 years apart. Getty named Jr. the president of Getty Oil Italiana in Rome, and while it was fine for a while, the drift occurred. 2 years after divorcing his first wife, Jr. married Dutch actress model Talitha Pohl. Together, the two embraced the counterculture of the late 60s, living off Jr.'s annual $100,000 income from the family trust. Jr. lost his job with the company as he and Talitha fell into drug addiction, and the two separated as she got sober. Jr. wound up running from Italy to escape drug charges, leaving behind his 16-year-old son, John Paul Getty III. Paul also drifted, kicked out of school, left to his own devices. He spent his nights in discotheques and his days squatting with friends. Even if Paul didn't have his grandfather's money, he had the name, and he used it to his advantage. He wasn't even above using the name to get paid for a nude photo spread in an Italian skin mag. And when he needed still more money, he plotted his own kidnapping. It's the exact scenario billionaires fear. Their children and grandchildren, entitled and not struggling, lean on their family's money and/or name to live carelessly. Unfortunately, courting that kind of attention makes you a target. Our third reason why being a billionaire sucks. When you're a billionaire, people try to get your money any way they can. Brian Clayton, CEO of GreenPal, started his first company when he was 18 and claims the first lawsuits against him came soon after. It's an issue that comes up with a lot of lottery winners. Lawsuits suddenly come out of the woodwork, whether it's from the liquor store owner who sold the ticket or a friend collecting on a 20-year-old promise to split winnings. It's why most lawyers advise clients to retain anonymity after a lottery win. But beyond the legal battles billionaires deal with on a day-to-day basis, there's also the threat against them and their family. Whether from blackmailers looking to exploit the personal lives of relatives or from kidnappers looking to extort money, William Randolph Hearst's granddaughter Patricia was kidnapped in 1974 and wasn't even returned after the ransom was paid. Instead, she was brainwashed into joining her kidnappers in a crime spree and wasn't rescued until late 1975. Many billionaires themselves have been kidnapped, like French industrialist Edouard Jean Ampin in 1978, who was held for 63 days for an 80 million franc ransom, or beer baron Freddie Heineken, who was kidnapped in 1983 and whose ransom of $11 million was the highest paid for a hostage. And famously, that happened with Paul Getty. Though he didn't go through with his plan to get himself kidnapped, an Italian crime syndicate wound up abducting him in 1973. They demanded $17 million in ransom from his grandfather. Instead of paying, he negotiated, even after the kidnappers cut off Paul's ear and mailed it to a newspaper. Even when the kidnappers reduced the demand to $3.3 million, Getty only agreed to pay $2.2 million, the maximum amount that could be tax-deductible. He loaned the remaining $800,000 to his son, Paul's father, at 4% interest. Though Paul was returned alive in December, the trauma would affect him for the rest of his life. He spiraled into drug and alcohol addictions, suffering a stroke after an overdose. When you have a lot of money, you and your family are in constant danger. By the way, a lot of people have a lot to say over the years about Getty's way of dealing with his grandson's kidnappers. That's the number 4 worst thing about being a billionaire. Your every action and decision is under a microscope, meaning added pressure to behave the quote-unquote right way. And what do people consider the right way? Generosity. There's an expectation toward billionaires that because they have so much money, they should be ready and willing to give up more and more of it. Engineer and tech thought leader Philip Remaker pointed out that people presume that you can readily tap your vast wealth to address any problem. You will always be criticized for not spending enough on something to solve the problem. The Boston survey we mentioned before, one of its architects described the word rich as having become a pejorative. There's an immediate dislike of people we believe have too much money. Some of that dislike makes sense. In economic crises such as the pandemic lockdowns of the past year or the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the billionaire class is the least affected. While American unemployment rates skyrocketed in 2020, its billionaire class increased their wealth by over $430 billion. South Korea, lauded by many for its ability to go from one of the poorest nations in the world to one of the most developed in less than 50 years, also sees a disparity, with only 1.3% of its population making middle-class earnings. Some of the wealthy try to assuage this money guilt by giving more and more, making charitable contributions, starting philanthropies, sponsoring advocacy groups. Even Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in modern history, said that the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. He devoted the final 18 years of his life to various philanthropies and foundations. Still, many billionaires note that it's impossible to fix every problem in the world, no matter how hard they try, and feel there's undue criticism that comes their way for not doing enough, even when they try to do something. Now, okay, the problem in J. Paul Getty's case was kidnapped grandson, and people judged him a lot for negotiating the final ransom price, and B, having his son pay it back. But consider things from his point of view. As he pointed out at the time, I have 14 grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren. He also reasoned that in addition to encouraging other criminals, paying would only whet the appetite of the original kidnappers. Just 2 years later, Patty Hearst's kidnappers refused to give her up after the ransom was paid. Getty, like many a billionaire before and after him, was left with a tough choice. Pay up, and he exposes himself as a soft touch. Don't pay up, and he confirms the public suspicions that the wealthy are greedy, uncaring people. Actually, Getty's actions were pretty canny. He knew what the kidnappers wanted more than anything was the millions of dollars. They weren't going to get rid of Paul, their only asset, before getting paid off. In negotiating the price down, Getty refused to let the criminals dictate the rules of society. And in making his son pay back the interest on the ransom, Getty was forcing him to actually take responsibility for a problem he had helped create. Though it does highlight a problem that you probably don't think billionaires have. It's our 5th reason why being a billionaire sucks. You worry about money. Obviously, we all worry about money, a lot of us because we don't seem to have enough of it. But becoming a billionaire doesn't make that go away. For one thing, people forget that in order to have billions of dollars, you have to make billions of dollars and keep making it. To quote the producer Remy Blumenfield, they worry about losing it, they worry about how it's invested, they worry about the effect it's going to have. They also know the value of every penny. Bill Gates admitted that despite being worth $75 billion, he would still pick up a $100 bill off the street, though he says he would then immediately donate it to his foundation. Besides keeping track of all that money, most billionaires also have to keep making it. And Business Insider pointed out that despite the sacrifices made to build your wealth, people will perceive you as working too hard, being too ruthless in business, that your success only comes because you've been heartless. Getty, for instance, could not take a moment off. His industrial empire consisted of over 200 different businesses. Seeing to the demands of his employees, family members, and apparently kidnappers, he worked 16 to 18-hour days, even at the age of 81. That's what it takes to maintain $1 billion. But because he worked for it, knew the value of it, and had others around him recognize the value, he was branded a heartless miser. One of the things he was infamous for was installing a payphone in his mansion for guests to use. But there was a reason. Getty found that visitors took advantage of his hospitality and would make lengthy long-distance calls on his dime. The payphone put a stop to that. His frugality extended to his children. When his 6-year-old son needed treatment for a brain tumor, Getty admonished his 5th and final wife for negotiating the medical bills ahead of time. His reasoning? Some doctors like to charge a rich person 20 times more than their regular fee. It's cold, it's calculated, it's how you maintain $1 billion empire. And that's the final reason you don't want to be a billionaire. It will change your sense of morality. The business acumen that made you a billionaire will also cloud some morality judgments. Like Bill Gates prioritizing maintaining intellectual property rights on life-saving vaccines over, accessibility to those life-saving medicines. Or the number of corporations that during World War II valued the cheap slave labor found in concentration camps. Corporations like Nestle and Kodak. When all you see is the bank account, profits become priority over people. That's not just a judgment on our part. Multiple studies have shown this to be true. The richer a person becomes, the more likely he is to cheat at games, run red lights, break traffic laws, and even shoplift. Though, as one wealth expert put it, having access to billions probably exacerbates your qualities, the worst and best part of you, because now you have the means to explore it with few consequences. This is what life would be like if Earth was twice as big. Let's start in space. For our thought experiment, we'll assume that Earth is double in every regard: mass, radius, volume, etc. This helps simplify our hypothetical super-Earth scenario and keeps the Earth from collapsing in on itself like a bad sponge cake. The Earth is also unlikely to be in the same orbit we're in today, not necessarily because of the effect of our increased mass on the Sun's pull, but because of the way we interact with other celestial bodies in our solar system. Much like you, after the rest of the party has had a few drinks, the Earth is suddenly much more attractive to everyone else in the solar system. And just like the super-Earth would nudge other orbits, they would nudge back. Jupiter is increasingly believed to have a significant effect on Earth's orbit, aiding habitability on our planet. If the Earth was twice as big and twice as hard to influence, we might not be in a position that's as beneficial to life as we find ourselves in today. But a super Earth might be a super death sentence for any life on Earth too. The Moon is believed to be critical to life on Earth. Its gravitational effect on the Earth produces predictable tides, which in turn helps keep the planet's climate stable and promote the growth of life. Double the Earth's gravitational pull, and it's unlikely we'd have a moon. Shortly after impact, much of the would-be moon debris would get dragged back down toward the planet's surface. Over time, the super-Earth would pull even more of the debris down, potentially robbing the moon of the material needed to form. We could have ended up with no moon at all, or with a moon a fraction of the size of the one we have today. Life on Earth would have been significantly affected, and probably not for the better. But there's an even bigger problem for the super-Earth than not having a moon. Doubling all the parameters of the planet means doubling the amount of material it contains. Specifically, that would mean doubling of radioactive elements on our planet. But no, this wouldn't mean everyone gets cancer-based superpowers. Instead, the decay of all those radioactive elements would further heat up our planet's core and mantle, leading to greatly increased volcanic activity from an abundance of magma beneath the crust. The Siberian Trap is a massive volcanic rock region stretching across northern Russia. Sometime around 250 million years ago, a massive plume of lava began to rise from the interior of the planet until reaching the crust. This resulted in an explosion of volcanic activity which lasted for about 2 million years, and it's possibly responsible for the Permian-Triassic mass extinction event. All that volcanism released massive amounts of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which led to massive global warming and the acidification of the oceans. Atmospheric carbon dioxide skyrocketed from an average of 400 parts per million to a whopping 2,500 parts per million. In case you're wondering, today we're still sitting around 420 parts per million. Estimates say that the oceans at the equator could have reached as hot as a scorching 104 degrees freedom units, or 40 degrees Celsius. Also known as the Great Dying, the Siberian Trap's disaster led to the extinction of an estimated 81% of all marine animals and 70% of land vertebrates. It's more difficult to gauge how many invertebrates died off due to the difficulty of finding fossilized remains. With a much hotter core, Super Earth would likely experience disasters like the Siberian Traps more frequently. But even just increased volcanism could prove difficult for life as we know it. When volcanoes blow their top, they can let off incredible amounts of greenhouse gases, so it's likely that our super Earth would be much hotter than our normal Earth at this same stage in its evolution. Global temperatures could range from just a few degrees hotter to 10 or more, severely impacting how life would have evolved, and putting into doubt the ability for intelligent life to arise and/or prosper. The atmosphere itself would also make life problematic. With a doubling of gravity, atmospheric pressure would be much greater than we're used to. The boiling point of water would be higher, and convection currents would be much closer to the ground. That means that the fluffy white clouds you're used to seeing today would be significantly closer to ground level, and that storms would have much more energy. All of that extra ocean would also allow devastating hurricanes to gain more steam over warm water, and Category 5 hurricanes would be the norm rather than the exception. Another feature of Super Earth directly impacting the evolution of life would be the terrain itself. With a doubling of gravity, Super Earth would have much smaller mountains and much flatter terrain. This would further compound the wind issue, as anyone from the Great Plains states of America can attest to. In fact, Super Earth might be so windy that life might prefer flight over living on land, but that's just speculation. For fans of majestic views though, Super Earth would be a disappointment due to a lack of mountains, and those mountains that did exist would be much smaller than the ones we know today. Super Earth could be more arid than normal Earth. Mountains often serve to stop cloud formations, forcing them to condense in one area until they inevitably release enough snow or rain to become light enough to float over them. This in turn leads to the creation of rivers that feed life all over the planet. With much lower mountains, this natural process may not be as common on Super Earth, leaving much of the planet barren from a lack of rainfall. Life may thrive only in pockets of the planet, with the rest made up of barren grasslands or deserts, where life specialized to survive off little rainfall might live. Trees, for example, would not grow as tall, as a tree can only grow as tall as it's economical for them to do in terms of energy. Trees and plants would therefore likely grow horizontally rather than vertically. In order to keep themselves upright, plants would also grow thicker, more fibrous stems. Flowers would probably still exist, if not be even more common, due to an explosion of flying life forms and the denser atmosphere. but they would bud from thick, tough, fibrous plants, killing the notion entirely of delicate as a flower. There's no room on Super Earth for daintiness. Flowers here would be tough and robust, with a greater propensity for airborne life. Plants that feast on flying insects like pitcher plants and carnivorous plants would be far more common, though they wouldn't be limited to insects. Plants would evolve to feed on a greater amount of birds too, which might serve as another evolutionary pressure for birds to grow bigger, or maybe just smarter. So where do humans fit in this stinky, armor-plated, giant insect-filled hellscape of a planet? The evolution of humanity is a serious question on Super Earth, at least in the way that it resembles what we look like today. With short, squat trees, mammals would find little benefit in becoming arboreal species, so the evolution of monkeys is unlikely. Assuming humans existed at all, cities would look very different from today. Rather than build skyscrapers, we would build outwards, dramatically reducing urban density and how many people could be housed in one geographic location. The good news is traffic would be dramatically reduced due to less urban density. But the bad news is that cities would sprawl outwards like an asphalt blight on the face of the planet, paving over untold amounts of wilderness. You can forget about roller coasters or water parks. The threat of serious injury would be far too great in the Super Earth's increased gravity. Most roller coasters we have on real Earth today would be death sentences on Super Earth, and rides that like to send their passengers plummeting in free fall would be impossible. Cars would need to be built sturdier, adding to the fuel burden that double gravity would already create. The fuel mileage of the average car would be atrocious, which could have dramatic effects on how society develops. If cars are only getting a quarter of the mileage they have gotten on real Earth, then Super Earth humans would have to go through much more of their planet's oil reserves faster than we have. Granted, their planet is twice as big, so things might even out, except when it comes to carbon emissions. Super Earth machines would require far more fuel to work and produce exponentially more greenhouse emissions than regular Earth. With an already warmer atmosphere due to increased volcanic activity, the Super Earth's man-made climate crisis could arrive far sooner than our own has and be much more deadly. Speed limits, however, would have to be strictly enforced, as crashes would be far deadlier on Super Earth than on regular Earth. Airplanes on Super Earth would not be impossible, simply far more difficult to operate. The development of flight would be significantly delayed until the creation of more powerful internal combustion engines than in our own timeline, though again, once aloft, they would have an easier time staying there. It's a toss-up between how much more efficient flying would be in a thicker atmosphere and how hard it would be to keep huge amounts of tonnage safely in the sky. The one barrier to flight might just be the landing, which might prove too dangerous to even attempt in the first place. Aircraft might be limited to operating near large bodies of water, where they can enjoy a more cushioned landing, and even then only when conditions are calm. The difficulties of living on Super Earth, insects the size of Rottweilers, heavy gravity, frequent superstorms, and constant volcanic activity might just be the impetus for Super Earth's humanity to leave their planet faster than us. After all, if where you live kinda sucks, you're probably going to be much more motivated to find a way to somewhere more comfortable. Since its founding in 2016, TikTok has been rapidly expanding and spreading its Macarena-like dances all over the globe, taking over social media. Working at such a fast-growing tech company must be pretty great, right? Well, you're about to find out, because TikTok wants you. High salaries, opportunities for growth, and a highly recognizable company right there on your resume for future job applications. What could go wrong? Well, the truth might not be all that rosy after all. In fact, TikTok might just be one of the worst places in the world to work. Think we're exaggerating? Let's take a look at what working at TikTok is really like, starting with the most common and insane complaint of former employees. Number 10. The 996 work culture. There are plenty of rumors online about China's 996 work culture, meaning working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, making its way over to TikTok's offices in the US. After all, the company is headquartered in China, meaning that it operates in some ways that are distinctly Chinese. But more on that later. According to former employees, including ex-lead product manager Melody Chu, not only are the insane work hours accurate, they can actually be even worse. Because the US TikTok team works with China's employees, evenings frequently consist of back-to-back meetings and work calls with their Chinese colleagues. Melody herself explains that her social life on weekdays was non-existent. According to her, I work over 60 hours a week. Over half of my team sits in China, so my meetings with China teammates start at 6 p.m. and end at 10 p.m., sometimes later. Perhaps if you're single, an introvert, and live alone, that doesn't sound like the worst thing ever, but let's face it,
Even single people need free time. But the problems compound exponentially if you're in a relationship, or have kids, or, a life. According to Melody, she missed almost every dinner with her husband because her job demanded that she be in meetings with Chinese coworkers all evening. Her marriage suffered immensely, sending both her and her husband to therapy. She seldom saw her parents even though they lived in the same town. The opportunity to work at TikTok might sound appealing for young techies starting in the industry. They can just power through for a few years and take the money and experience before moving to a job with more normal working hours. But prospective employees have to seriously think about how working over 60 to 65 hours a week will impact every relationship in their lives. Even a couple of years of constantly working and buried in a laptop is enough to ruin most relationships and do a number on your mental health. Some employees had even more horrific stories than Melody's, estimating that they averaged 85 hours of meetings per week. To give you an idea of how insane that is, if you're getting your recommended 8 hours of sleep a night, that means you spend more time in meetings than sleeping, as 8 times 7 equals only 56 hours of sleep. One woman had to attend so many back-to-back meetings without a break, she had no time to change her sanitary protection. Something that women inform us usually takes a grand total of 30 seconds to a minute. That being said, many young workers in Silicon Valley have become accustomed to crazy hours, and let's face it, TikTok has some of the craziest. So this might not seem so shocking, especially when you're making bank. Maybe those evening meetings and endless hours are all worth it to get a stupendous amount of money at the end of the day. Well, not if a fair chunk of that money won't be worth anything. Number 9. Your salary may not be what it seems. TikTok employees, like most corporate employees, get salaries and bonuses that are on the high side. The median salary for a software engineer at ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, is $213,000. Even in Silicon Valley, that's a fair amount of cash. But a lot of the great bonuses advertised for prospective employees come from something called Vested Restricted Stock Units, or RSUs. This isn't exactly your normal stock option, as ByteDance has not been listed publicly on the stock exchange for many reasons we'll get to in a bit. However, they basically amount to a guarantee of future equity in the company. Future equity in a fast-growing company might sound like a great bonus, but there is a bit of a problem with this. TikTok's future is a little uncertain, with big markets like the US discussing bans. This means the RSUs of a current US TikTok employee would plummet in value pretty quickly. Even if a ban doesn't occur, the nature of the very volatile tech industry, combined with the unpredictable nature of social media apps, means that the future of TikTok is always up in the air. Think of how quickly X's valuation and user base has gone down the drain since a certain South African billionaire took over. And if that's not enough to discourage you from applying, here's another problem. Number 8. Chinese management styles can cause a lot of problems. ByteDance's headquarters are in China, with offices operating out of Singapore, but generally all major decisions come down from the Chinese team. While TikTok has a huge presence in Silicon Valley, the US office is very much subordinate to the Chinese directors. This also means that managerial styles are mostly Chinese, with very little influence from Silicon Valley work culture. For someone who has only lived and worked in the US, this can lead to a whole host of problems. Chinese managerial styles tend to prioritize speed of work above all else, unfortunately usually including work-life balance and the mental health of their employees. To incentivize incredibly rapid modes of working and development, one of the major management tactics used is splitting up workers into teams and forcing them to compete, sort of like a tech industry version of the Hunger Games. This may sound effective, but it actually creates a whole host of problems, chief of which is inefficiency. Let's go back to Melody Chu. She described various times where she and her team had been working on a new product for TikTok, only to discover that another team, either in the same office or in China, has also been working on something very similar. So essentially, teams were sometimes overlapping on the same exact projects instead of dividing it up between various employees. And that's because the directive from TikTok's management was to build separately for now and will integrate sometime in the future. However, teams had no clear guidance on how anything would be integrated or even when these new products would be expected. And due to a lack of transparency and the spirit of intense competition, no one had any idea how fast the other team was working. All the team leaders knew was that their team had to win. And to win, they had to work faster and better than the other team. This created a completely paranoid working culture where teams would constantly feel like their coworkers were forging ahead, withholding helpful information, and generally untrustworthy. Not the most collaborative environment imaginable, which leads us nicely to our next entry. Number 7. You won't be able to get information you need. One of the other problems with the work culture at TikTok is a relative lack of transparency. Employees, even high-ranking ones in the US office, don't always have access to all the information they need in order to do their job. Leaders at Chinese headquarters would tend to keep critical information and strategies pretty close to their chest, leaving workers wondering what exactly they were working toward. Sometimes employees couldn't even access basics about their own company. TikTok's organizational charts are obscured in company files, and pretty much all documents are locked up by default. This creates an incredibly frustrating company culture for employees trying to find or even double-check basic company data. We don't want to paint a picture of China's TikTok headquarters as a super secretive and shadowy organization that refuses to work with their US counterparts. A big chunk of the problem comes down to cultural differences, the most prominent of which is the language barrier. Number 6. Mandarin speakers preferred. Part of the problem with TikTok's Chinese headquarters sharing information with their US teams is that most important documents are in Mandarin Chinese. As you can imagine, for English speakers on the west coast of the United States, this causes more than a bit of a problem. And honestly, the process of translating hundreds and thousands of pages of documents and research into English from Mandarin every time a project needs to happen is incredibly frustrating and time-consuming, which is why sometimes the Chinese teams just opt for not doing it. And to be fair, neither does the American team. Since TikTok's US office is essentially a satellite office of the company's Chinese headquarters, the vast majority of the documents that require translation and the people who are heading up the company are Chinese. This also creates a major unspoken criteria when it comes to hiring and promotions. Non-Chinese Americans do work at TikTok, of course, but being able to speak some level of Mandarin usually counts a lot for prospective employees. This also impacts the chances of career progression in the company, with Mandarin speakers being promoted faster than non-speakers. Essentially, if you don't speak Mandarin, a bright future at TikTok might not be in the cards for you. This also means that often important discussions happening in TikTok's Chinese headquarters end up excluding a lot of US employees who could probably benefit from listening to them. So if you don't speak Mandarin, you won't be invited to the party, except in this case, the party is a meeting concerning decisions that will immediately affect your work environment and the future of your career, which takes us neatly to the next issue. Number 5. Miscommunications abound. Even worse, when people actually bother to translate information, it actually creates more problems than it solves. Former employees have stated that miscommunication ran rampant. English and Mandarin Chinese are worlds apart. In fact, they are rated as one of the hardest languages for speakers of the other to learn, even if you're maintaining your daily streak on Duolingo. This can lead to a lot of lost in translation moments, especially when the person translating documents isn't exactly fluent in the original language. One employee placed the language comprehension rate at 75% accuracy on both sides when it came to workplace misunderstandings, which is better than a coin toss, but not great when the translation you need to understand involves your work project for the next 3 months. All these differences in language and work culture create an unfathomably challenging environment, but also resentment and distrust on both sides, meaning US and Chinese employees that should be teammates and co-workers sometimes tend not to work well together. Number 4. Teamwork is incredibly challenging. Due to the fact that the two countries are located almost in polar opposite time zones, they also only have 4 hours a day to even attempt collaboration. This might not sound like that much of a problem until you realize that no US TikTok product teams operate independently from Chinese headquarters. This requires constant communication and collaboration between the teams. Ex-employees have mentioned that they were given a fair amount of responsibilities and learned a lot during their time at TikTok, but there is a reliance on Chinese leads controlling the project. The Chinese teams won't let go of good projects, and whenever one moves to the US, a tech lead from China will quickly follow. As you can imagine, this further breaks down the relationships between the Chinese and American teams working at ByteDance. And that brings us to another big problem when working for TikTok. Number 3. Your job is dependent on geopolitics. Funnily enough, the lack of trust and occasional resentment between TikTok's US and Chinese employees mirrors the lack of trust between the countries they reside in. Your job may be completely upended by your country's politics, and by your country, we're not just talking about China or the US, we're talking about both. Whenever the US-China geopolitical relationship hits a rough patch, workers at TikTok and ByteDance are often left in the lurch, worried about their future and the future of the company itself. For the last few years, US politicians have proposed bans on TikTok, which are being seriously considered more and more. In 2024, there will be challenges to a proposed TikTok ban in the US heard in court, which may determine the outcome of the company within the country. Obviously, banning the social media app in one of its biggest markets would be a crushing blow to TikTok, and it would probably result in a number of layoffs, most obviously of all in its Silicon Valley branch. If the US banned American citizens from using the app, it seems unlikely TikTok would be okay with American citizens working for the app. Meanwhile, Chinese authorities have started to clamp down on a lot of publicly listed US tech companies. This also allows them to suppress spread of information amongst their own citizens, who live in a mostly government-controlled environment. This makes it even more unlikely that ByteDance will ever be listed on the US stock exchange. This might seem like a lot of geopolitical posturing, but it has very real consequences for people working at TikTok. And even when those bans and crackdowns remain political talking points, the strained relationship between the US and China creates a lot of anxiety for those working at the company. Imagine pouring 12 hours a day, minimum 6 days a week, into your career and the company you work for, only to have that tossed aside because of political rivalries. It just adds an extra layer of stress to an already challenging job. And that brings us to one of the most controversial and most ethically problematic issues about working for TikTok. Number 2. Your company may be spying on you. According to Australian cybersecurity firm Internet 2.0, TikTok requests access to an enormous amount of phone data. CEO Robert Potter said the permission layer that the phone was requesting was significantly more than what they said they were doing publicly. When the app is in use, it has the ability to scan the entire hard drive, access the contact lists, as well as see all other apps that have been installed on the device. You might be thinking, doesn't every social media app do that at this point? If you want to buy a t-shirt online, you end up having to create an account, agree to the terms and conditions you've never read, and sign up for a newsletter that will annoy you on a weekly basis until you can be bothered to unsubscribe. Even visiting a local news site means giving your browser permission to track a hell of a lot of your online and phone activity. In today's online world, we have given up a lot of our rights to privacy, especially data privacy, which makes it even more concerning that coders and developers without any particular political bias are signaling out TikTok as an outlier in the sheer amount of information it gets from users. Not only that, but a lot of built-in data protections that phones and various servers now provide are bypassed by TikTok. Android users learned to their horror that TikTok was overriding their phone's built-in protections to collect their MAC addresses, which essentially shows the user's physical location. Of course, the fact that TikTok is fully owned by not just a foreign company, but a company that operates within a country that frequently finds itself at odds with the US government is even more concerning. At this point, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with TikTok's employees, especially their US ones? After all, they're not the ones directly, personally requesting the data from the average user. Well, for a lot of people, it creates an ethical conundrum and one employees seriously have to consider. There have been a lot of allegations, which are not entirely unfounded, that China is using TikTok to not only gather obscene amounts of data on US citizens, which brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing aspect of working at TikTok. Number 1. You're probably enabling Chinese propaganda. In 2017, China passed an intelligence law that says it can force ByteDance to give it any information on US citizens that Chinese intelligence operations request. It was found that a lot of the videos promoted by the TikTok algorithm tended to favor the Chinese view of global events, even if that included rampant misinformation. The app's own ad library found that Chinese propaganda ads had been pushed to millions of people in Europe. These ads were not only related to Chinese Communist Party or CCP talking points, but also to the foreign interests of the party. Propaganda happens on all sides, but it is concerning that a deeply undemocratic nation like China, a country that highly represses its own people, now has free access to so much information on US users, especially the American youth. It provides a way to manipulate users that the Chinese viewpoint is the correct one, enabling political audiences to fall in line with Chinese stances on various international issues, including geopolitical ones. We are already having a lot of trouble distinguishing objective, factual data from misinformation on the internet. So adding another method to spread disinformation for a country that actively operates against the US is something to be concerned about. And if you're working for TikTok as a US citizen, it's something you might want to be concerned about as well. At the end of the day, it seems like even though TikTok may offer a great learning opportunity for developers and seemingly great compensation package, the downsides of the company lead to a lot of people fleeing the company sooner or later, and even flat out turning down job offers. So, if you have an offer, maybe think twice about it. Now that you heard former employees' stories about working at TikTok, perhaps check out other horror stories from around the world, like the ones found in this video here or this other video.